Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman
and Jonathan Lack.
We are here to step into the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour, the Grand Tour. That's right, we are stepping once more into the Grand Tour of anime. This week on the show, we have a case of deja vu at Japanimation Station because we are talking about Dororo. You may think that we talked about Dororo last week, and that's because we did, but we're talking about Dororo this week, but as we're not talking about that Dororo, no, we're talking about this Dororo. Dororo, the 2019 modern TV adaptation of Dororo, simply called Dororo. This is the MAPPA adaptation along with Tezuka Productions. It's a co-production, and this is also the first Dororo that I watched back in 2019 because this show made quite a splash when it originally came out. So I watched it, then I read the manga, and then 5 years later, we're now here to record a podcast. And I had a lot of fun revisiting the show. I think it's a great show, but I also think it's a very fascinating show to see in comparison to the original because they're kind of almost mirrors of each other in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. And there are lots of interesting things in terms of the adaptation for this new one. But Jonathan, this is the first time you have seen the 2019 Dororo, so I'm curious, what were your thoughts?
Well, I have just a fundamentally different access point to it than you do.
Yes.
Because this is not my introduction to Dororo. This is my conclusion to Dororo. I read the manga, I watched the anime, I made it through about half of the live-action movie. We'll talk about that later. It's not very good. And now we're watching this, and so, I know there's more Dororo out there, and I'm 100% sure there will be another Dororo anime one day in the future. But for now...
inevitable.
Yeah, but for now, this is it, and I have mixed feelings on this. I think it's a good show, and I think if I had never read the Tezuka manga or seen the 69 anime, I would be more positive on it, and I do try to just look at it through the lens of this show as a show, but that is tough, especially in this concentrated time period where we're looking at all things Dororo. And I do think as an adaptation, there are things I like. I think its take on Hyakkimaru is really interesting and cool, and I think ultimately the show's greatest strength and the spine underpinning what is good about it. I don't really like its take on Dororo, the character. I think it's a really flat characterization that winds up by the end being pretty much an afterthought of a character, and I think it's weird for a show named Dororo to do that. And I think there's a tension in the show that I noticed particularly around the Banmon episode, which is that, and then I think it continues on all the way through the end, which is that this is a much more grounded take on Dororo. It attempts to be more quote-unquote realistic in its presentation of Hyakkimaru and the world. It tries to think through the mechanics of the world Tezuka built more fully. It is more graphically violent than the other adaptations. Part of that is it being in color and you see all the red blood and whatnot. But it is just in part because there is just more animation than in the 69 show. There can be more violence. But it is also a much softer version of the story than what Tezuka wrote. Sure. It has a lot less cruelty. Its vision of Daigo is completely different. Its vision of Hyakkimaru's role in the world, and I think the way it views sort of the violence underpinning this society, it's a much softer take on the story. And I think that tension to me is probably something I wouldn't have noticed had I not read the manga before this, but it's one of the most striking things about the manga, and it's something that was weird to me here. I think the show is at its strongest when it is doing its own thing and focusing on what is original to this story. I think pretty much whenever it was adapting a story that had been directly adapted in the 69 anime, I was not into it. And I think those episodes suffer in a very similar way to me to how like the first 13 episodes of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood suffer in comparison to the manga or the original anime, where it feels very fast and sometimes half-hearted, in part because of that softening effect I talked about. It's a great production. It's absolutely fucking gorgeous. The music is great. That first theme song is an all-timer. The voice acting is fantastic. All of that stuff. I think it's a good show, but those are my like reservations with it.
Yeah, and I think I definitely see where you're coming from. For me, I think what's really interesting is kind of like I said a little bit earlier, these are kind of like mirror adaptations to me, the original and this one, and that their strengths and weaknesses are almost exactly opposite, where the original anime adaptation, particularly the first half, right? It's a little hard to talk about the original anime adaptation because it's kind of two shows in one. But if you're talking
literally,
about
it had a different title at the second half, so
yes.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about the Sugi Gizaburo version, the first half that is very faithfully adapting the manga, both the manga and that adaptation are very strong in the like individual stories are so good. Like they're just so impeccably good. So
Yeah.
each of the individual arcs are just amazing. But they both have the same problem, which is that the overarching story is very poorly structured because you hit the Banmon chapter and it hits this incredible narrative high so early on in what was originally projected to be a much longer story. And so it ultimately sort of, I think, like, especially obviously the anime adaptation goes fucking crazy because of other production stuff. But even the manga, I think, becomes very wayward and kind of confused in the bigger picture story it's trying to tell.
It's tough to judge, obviously, because the manga was not finished. It switched magazines, his page count got cut down, and the anime went through its own shift. So you always have to read both of those through a lens of, like, there's almost an archival thing of, like, these are unfinished tellings of the tale. But you're absolutely right. Because of that quality, yes, there is no... I think the anime... The finale is so good, in retrospect, it doesn't bother me as much, but the manga is totally wayward by the end. Yeah.
Yeah. But I would also say that, like, and just based on, like, some of the stuff I saw in my research, that I think Tezuka Osamu struggled to figure out where to take that story, regardless of, like, you know, the other things that happened along the way. I think some of those things happened partially because he didn't know where to go. It kind of felt like Banmon was the story he really wanted to tell, and then he told that story, and then it's like, okay, then what do I do with these characters? What do I do with this narrative setup? And so all those individual stories are amazing, but they don't, to me, really cohere into a larger narrative, in part also because, of course, then it never truly gets to get finished either way. Whereas the modern adaptation has, like, the opposite thing, where a lot of the individual episodes, particularly the one-off episodes, are fine. Like, I don't think there are any that are, like, terrible. I think there are a couple that are pretty mediocre, particularly, like, the original one-offs, I think, in the first half are kind of rough in a couple of places, but they're totally fine. The thing that the new show does incredibly well is the overarching story. And all those individual, like, single episodes are about building up the relationship between Dororo and Hyakkimaru. It's about telling this buddy story and a kind of road trip story. And I think that element of the new show is incredibly good. And so when you get to the ending, to me, there's a huge amount of payoff to seeing these characters having grown and developed, and especially Hyakkimaru, who is the best part of the new show, and seeing how he has changed and grown as a person. Like, I think that aspect of the new show is so good and is so effective. And then also, the other thing I really appreciate about the new show is that it is not trying to tell the same story on a narrative, like, thematic level. So the original story is all about, like, war and the consequences of war. And the new story is, like, has that there as a element, but it's not about that. It's about the notion of, like, a society built on sacrificing those who are marginalized. And I think the way that theme is explored is very powerful and is also very relevant. I think it's a smart way to update the idea of this story to the 21st century, where for this audience, we are not people who have lived through a war, nor are we people who are living under the shadow of a war that could break out at any moment, which is the context of the original series, having been made by people who lived through World War II and made during the Cold War, when who knows when another nuclear war could break out. Whereas in 2019, it's so much more about the way in which we live in a society that is actively built off of the sacrifices of people who are invisible to us, and we happily live off of those sacrifices and are resistant to changing things to reduce our own level of sort of like abundance and comfort. And that's very much what this show is about. And I think that theme is very like relevant and potent to me.
This is probably one of the more disagreements we're going to have on Japanimation Station, because I agree. I wish that was the theme. I wish that came more through more fulsomely, because that's what I kept thinking. One of my problems with this show is I think there's a weirdly schizophrenic way it presents the idea of the sacrifice and what the demons are doing for the landscape, and how long it takes for the show for someone to vocalize the idea that it is fucking bonkers nuts to think it's okay to sacrifice a baby to get these things. And like, there's some of that. I think Hyakkimaru's arc is good. Again, I just don't think Dororo really has an arc. I think he's a very backgrounded character in this version. And there's just, and some of the other stuff. Like, I think it's a show that talks about its themes a lot. Like, it talks about its themes way more than the 1969 version. There's just, especially like the penultimate episode is just like a long monologue about the themes of the show. And I felt like more thematic incoherence by the end, in part because I think there's less room for the viewer to come in and inhabit the world in the way you do in other versions of the story. So that was part of my frustration with it.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that criticism. I don't know. I think partially it's about the journey of like going along with Dororo and Hyakkimaru on the journey. It's got very much that kind of road trip quality to it. That I think like allows you to feel the tension of, to me, what is like a real tension in the world we live, which is we do sacrifice babies for our own abundance. Like, we actively do that every single day, then for the prosperity of our society, and we are resistant to fighting that. And so I think that tension as it exists in the show, in showing that like it is scary to try to fight against that instinct to say like our prosperity is more important than the prosperity of people that we do not see. And I think the show is effective at how it explores that idea, at least to me.
I agree with that completely. I think part of my problem is it spends a lot more time, particularly in the second batch of episodes, the second core, on scolding Hyakkimaru for wanting to get his fucking body back from these evil demons who are killing people, than it does scolding the people who sacrificed his fucking body. Like, there's some of that just like, it takes so long to get to the denouement where someone flips that around and considers it from Hyakkimaru's perspective. And maybe that's part of the point, like you're saying, and that's fine. It bothered me, but maybe this is something we can put a pin in and come back to.
Yeah, I think we can get into that, because I think I find that tension effective, where maybe it was frustrating for you. But let's get into the background and that kind of stuff, and then we can dig into the structure, the themes of the show after that. So with my notes, the first section I have on my notes is before we get into the production of this show, which honestly I didn't find like a huge amount of like fascinating behind the scenes stuff with the production of this show specifically. There weren't like a lot of in-depth interviews I found. But I did spend some time going through and looking at what happened with Dororo in the interim, because this is a weird fucking franchise because it's a franchise, and it's not something you would ever think would be a like franchise or like an enduring IP, because, you know, to recap, it starts as a single 4-volume manga that has like a weird, crazy production history and ultimately gets canceled, and a concurrent adaptation of that manga for TV that also has a crazy production history and also gets canceled, right? Like, as far as we know, that original show was meant to be a full year 50 to 52 episode thing, and it ends up not being that. It ends up being half of that. So it is a series that both in manga and original TV adaptation was not particularly popular, even if it was well regarded critically, and both of those got canceled. And yet, Dororo is behind Astro Boy and Blackjack, which are the two most, or Astro Boy, Tetsuan Atom, however you want to refer to it. Those are Tezuka's two most like enduring popular series, with like the largest number of adaptations into various media and all that kind of stuff. Outside of those two, I would say Dororo is the next biggest one in a weird way, even though he's got lots of other longer running manga that certainly are very popular, have anime adaptations. Dororo has so much. So here's just like, I went through and I tried to list everything I could find of other Dororo things that happened between the original and our 2019 show. So in 1969, we briefly mentioned this, but I want to bring it up again. There was an original novelization of Dororo written by Tsuji Masaki, which was an adaptation of the original anime made concurrent to that anime. But there are a notable number of different differences with that one, including, I believe this is the earliest version of a story where Tahomaru survives, which is a pretty consistent change that lots of adaptations make, which I think is honestly a smart change if you're thinking about taking this story to the end. I think Tahomaru getting killed off at Banmon is one of the things that makes that story a hard story to follow up, because it's such a big dramatic peak to have Hyakkimaru kill his own younger brother at like the fourth or fifth storyline.
Except it makes for like the most powerful moment of the original manga, which is him recognizing he's done this. Like the shock of it is part of the point of it in that story. Like I feel like that's a critique taking it out of the context of the actual telling of the story.
So, but this is like part of my thing is I think it makes Banmon so good. Okay. I think it is also one of the things that makes Banmon a very hard act to follow. So I think it's one of the things that's difficult about the structure of the original series is like, how do you one up that moment? And again, that's so early. Like that's so early. But we can get to that later. But so this is the first time Tahomaru survives, which is a pretty consistent change. Also, Dororo is a boy in this one. And that is not because Tsuji Masaki wanted to make it an intentional change. It's because he did not know that there was going to be a gender reveal that Dororo was actually a girl. Because again, the last part of the manga and the anime were being made around the same time. And so he, writing this novel, didn't know what the full story was. So he was just kind of going off of his best guess. And that also, we talked about this on the last episode, because the anime was originally supposed to run for a full year, his time to write the novel got cut down by like 3 or 4 months while he was writing it, which is probably a very hard thing to do, to just tell someone, oh, by the way, finish that novel 4 months earlier than you thought you had. It's like, okay, great, thanks. But from what I understand, that novel is fairly well liked amongst the Dororo fan base, but it is an interesting different thing. The next one I have, so there's a big jump here. We jump by 20 years. But in 1989, there was a video game made. This is a fairly obscure thing. There's an adventure game called Dororo Chapter of the Hell Scroll, which was developed by the company Quasarsoft for the 8800 series of Japanese PCs. So it only exists on this like relatively obscure old Japanese PC. The game is in the style of classic adventure games, a la the 80s Famicom Tante Club games. If you've ever seen a game like that, where it's got like sort of pixelated graphics, and there's like a menu on the side with a range of options like talk, grab object, inspect thing, and you pick those things and you sort of just kind of go through this mystery. It is an original story and a pseudo sequel to the manga, so it takes place after some vague point in the manga, I think before the ending, but somewhere in like the space there. It has a lot of original characters and monsters, and you can find playthroughs of it online if you're curious to see it. It's kind of wild. Hyakkimaru has red hair in that, which is sometimes how he was colorized in various media, and so it's if you wanted to see some red-haired Hyakkimaru, that's one of the red-haired ones. Then we jump up to 2001. In 2001, there was a new novelization made for Dororo, which was released in 3 separate volumes. This was written by Toriyami Jinzo, and he had been a major script writer at Tezuka Productions back in the 60s and 70s. There wasn't a lot of details I could find about this one in terms of the plot, but the main thing I noticed when I was trying to read some of the synopsis stuff was that it seemed like they expanded a lot on Jukai's character, the guy who makes the prosthetics for Hyakkimaru, and some of that stuff seems similar to what the new show does. So I think some of what they do with Jukai is kind of borrowed a little bit from this novelization, again, just by glancing at the synopses, which doesn't give you a lot of detail.
And by 2001, we're now into after Tezuka's death.
Yes.
With these versions, so
yeah, and this novelization was also relatively popular. I think it was one of the main things that started to spur the big resurgence in interest for Dororo in the 21st century, because then we get to 2004. This thing I can talk about more in depth because I've almost finished it. I'm on the last level. There's a PS2 action game, a kind of character action game called simply Dororo in Japan, but it did come out over here because 2004, you're just getting in under the line that you're still part of that wave of popularity we had in like the late 90s, early 2000s, before that kind of died off for anime stuff. And so they brought it over here with the title Blood Will Tell, Tezuka Osamu's Dororo, which is a sick title. I like Blood Will Tell. Sounds like it should be like, I don't know, a Jean-Claude Van Damme action movie you find in like a bargain bin or something. I like it. I also think it's interesting that they have his name as Tezuka Osamu and not Osamu Tezuka in the subtitle. But so it did come out over here with a full English localization and voiceover and stuff like that. The game is quite well regarded as kind of like a cult hit. in particular because it's just a fucking cool game. So the game makes use of Hyakkimaru's sort of unique constitution. I don't know how else to refer to it, right? The fact that he's missing 48 parts of his body, where the game has you fight demons or fiends, as they're called in the English dub localization. And when you defeat them, you get a part of your body back with like a little cutscene of him going, "Argh!" And then he gets his eye back or whatever. And when you get parts back of your body, you get stat boosts, and then for the really important ones, you also get new abilities. So like that game, I mentioned this last time, it starts with a tutorial in black and white, and then when you beat the first boss, he gets one of his eyes back, and then the game is in color from that point. His mental like voiceover is all like has this weird effect on it until you get your vocal cords and you can talk. There's a lot of stuff like that, and it's a really cool game. It also is pretty well known for its original ending, which it has an original ending that's inspired by that weird cut material from the second manga run that has the notion that Dororo is like a thing made by the demons that has some of Hyakkimaru's body parts, and to get all of his stuff back, he has to kill Dororo. So if you do, I haven't done this yet because I haven't finished the game, but if you beat the game and then you go back and you do a kind of New Game Plus thing and kill all the secret demons and get your 47 out of 48 of your body parts back, you then get a secret ending where a grown-up Dororo confronts Hyakkimaru, and then they have to fight, but then figure out like a whole thing, and then he gets his whole body back. And yeah, it's just a really cool game. If people are interested in playing it, it's pretty easy to find an ISO online to emulate it, especially if you want the undubbed version that gives you all the Japanese voices, which is what I would very much recommend, because the Japanese cast of this game is ridiculously stacked. So Sugita Tomokazu, who you would know as Kyon from Haruhi, plays Hyakkimaru, but this is a very, very early role for Sugita, which is interesting. It's 2 years before Kyon in Gintama, so 2006 is his big breakout year, where he's like, becomes this very well-known actor. And so if you want to hear a pretty young Sugita Tomokazu as a main character in something, it's pretty cool.
That's awesome, because for like the original interpretation of Hyakkimaru, not the one in like the 2019 show, but the one in like 69, Sugita has to be like the modern voice actor best suited for that. That's like such a good piece of casting, and obviously especially good piece of casting before anyone had heard him do something this big. So that's awesome.
But the rest of the people are not newbies. They are all very big when this came out. So you've got Otani Ikue, of course, Pikachu is the voice of Dororo. This is a fairly different idea of Dororo, partially because they age up the character a bit, because it's like for the time realistic PS2 graphics, so they don't look like cartoon characters. They're meant to look like people. So they age up Dororo a bit, but it's a very good performance. You get Otsuka Akio, who in the new version plays Jukai. In this, he is Daigo Kagemitsu. And that's a very good. Kusao Takashi, Trunks from Dragon Ball, is Tahomaru, which is fun. Seki Tomokazu, who is like Domon Kashu and G Gundam, etc. He's Saburota, who I like. Saburota is a character who's not in the original anime. He is in the manga. He's also in the new 2019 one. But in everything he appears in, he's just a completely different fucking character. So the new one is the Nakamura Yuichi character in the New A episode, and that's just the name of the character, Saburota. He has no resemblance really to the character for the manga.
I did not know Saburota was in the new anime until you said the Nakamura Yuichi character, and I'm like, that's who that was? Okay.
And in this one, he is like a samurai dude who fights Hyakkimaru, but is also actually a demon who Hyakkimaru has to kill to get his body parts back. And so Saburota is like an obscure manga character who's in some of the latter chapters that just later adaptations just go, we'll just have a dude named Saburota because there was one in the manga, but we'll just do something different with him. Tatsuki Fumihiko, who's Gendo Ikari from Eva. He's Tanosuke, the guy who's possessed by the cursed sword. Tsuru Hinomi, who's the original voice of Bulma, plays Misaki, is what the character's named here, but it's Osushi in the original. That's the younger sister of Tanosuke, who her role is expanded a lot in the game because she goes on, she tries to hunt down Hyakkimaru in a later level to get revenge for her brother, and she gets possessed by a demon. This is a very fun one. Ono Daisuke plays the Kane Kozo, which is the little yokai that goes Yaro ka in the Bandai story. Early on, which you could not possibly tell that's him because all he says is Yaroka, but it is Ono Daisuke. Obviously, that's a pretty early one for him as well. This is pre-air. Shibata Hidekatsu, the third Hokage, also the Omega or Sin Shinron, or the one-star dragon from Dragon Ball GT. He is the Fair Fudo, as well as a bunch of smaller roles. Anytime you run into a village and there's an old dude, it's just Shibata Hidekatsu playing him. He plays like 6 old dudes in it, but he's also the Fair Fudo statue, which is cool. And then the big one, because I guess they had Zenigata be the VO for the narration in the original 1969 Dororo, as well as Daigo, they decided to go with a different Lupin actor for this one, for the narrator. So they got Kobayashi Kiyoshi, who's Jigen, the original voice of Jigen, is the narrator. So between each level, there's like a cool piece of narration talking about like transitioning you from level to level. And I love that they're just like, we'll get another Lupin actor to do the narration, because fuck it, why not?
That is fucking awesome. Now I really do need to play this. And it's funny to say the phrase original voice of Jigen. He was Jigen until like 3 years ago, for like 50 years. And the person who took over is Otsuka Akio, who's also in this game and anime. So that's amazing. I want to play this. I mean, I've wanted to play it for all these reasons, because it sounds really cool. But yeah, that is a insanely stacked cast.
Yeah, and it's a legitimately fun little game. It's definitely like, it's got some rough edges as a kind of PS2 character action game that is, a fairly budget kind of title. I don't go in expecting it to play like Devil May Cry or Ninja Gaiden or something like that. But it does just have like a lot of really cool ideas, and it's fun to see another remix of this story, because it's another one where like it's relatively faithful until you get after Banmon. And then after you get to Banmon, they just remix basically all the stuff from the second half of the manga, gets like remixed and thrown into a blender and turns into a totally different thing. It's pretty interesting. I'm excited to finish it. I just haven't had time to get through that last level. But anyways, so that's 2004. Also in 2004, they made a stage adaptation of Dororo. This was called Shinjōruri Hyakkimaru from Tezuka Osamu's Dororo. This play was written by Yokochi Kensuke and performed by the theater group Tobidaza. It had a revival in 2009 and then another revival in 2019, which coincided obviously with the new anime. Although note on that later, there's another stage adaptation, which we'll talk about. Unfortunately, I was really looked hard because I was curious to see if I could find any footage of the play. I could not find footage of the actual play to look at, but I did find a full 2-hour dramatic reading of the script by voice actors Kaji Yuki and Miki Shinichiro, which is cool. So it's very easy to find if you just Google the name of the play or put it into YouTube. It's the first thing that will pop up. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but it was just, it's cool. One thing that's interesting about this is that Hyakkimaru is credited to 2 different roles. So one actor plays Hyakkimaru's body, which they refer to as Hyakkimaru's shadow, and then one actor is the voice of the character Hyakkimaru's voice, because this is, I guess that's their idea of dealing with how does Hyakkimaru talk to people when he doesn't have vocal cords, which is a thing that the original versions of the story just didn't give a shit about. And they're like, I don't know, they just hear what he says somehow.
The manga has more detail than in the anime about he has psychic powers and he projects his sound into people's minds and moves his lips. They didn't really explain that in the anime version.
Yeah, they do have that line in the anime, but I think particularly when you actually are having voices,
yes,
you just can't buy that explanation. Sounds so fucking ridiculous. He's just making shit up at that point is what it sounds like.
It works on the page because it's a page and you're seeing text and it's a different thing in the anime. But in the anime also, he doesn't say that until he gets his voice back. And Dororo's like, you were talking to me this whole time. What the fuck are you talking about? And he's like, no. I was projecting into your mind, which sounds like he's been making the whole thing up the whole time.
Yes, it's very funny. Okay, and then in 2007, and Jonathan, you'll be able to talk a little bit about this one. I did not watch any of it, but there was a live-action film adaptation of Dororo. It was made and directed by Shiota Akihiko, and starring Tsumabaki Satoshi as Hyakkimaru and Nagayama Eita as Dororo. You'll be able to talk about this more in depth, but the movie made substantial changes, from what I understand, to the story and setting of the original. The movie was a big commercial success. It was the 8th highest grossing movie in Japan in 2007, with a gross of 3.5 billion yen. And there were 2 sequels they were going to make. So they planned out 2 sequels, but they never came about. I never found any details about why the sequels were never made, but they just kind of died sometime in development. But Jonathan, you said you watched half of this movie. I'm curious, what were your thoughts? What was it like?
I didn't like it. I should probably give it another chance and watch more of it. This was during the entire period where I was scrambling to move from one house to another while also graduating and traveling to Iowa. But it's a really bizarre take on Dororo. I don't know how else to say it. Like, it's something where, like, yes, the 1969 version, it's goofy that he can just talk. I also think something that this version runs into, that I think the 2019 anime runs into a little bit, but overall I think actually leans into it and does it well, is overthinking the Hyakkimaru dynamics. And I think, like I said, I think the 2019 anime ultimately balances that idea pretty well, because it really, like, considers what it would be like if you did this, and this with Hyakkimaru, if he couldn't talk, if he couldn't hear, blah, blah, blah. What this version does is it's like, well, we're going to have him played by a fleshy human being, not a guy with like, wooden limbs. So instead of doing any kinds of special effects for that, they re-engineer the Jukai character to be a mad scientist, and all the stuff with Hyakkimaru plays like Frankenstein, where he has, like, electricity come down and he, like, pulls the levers. And what he's doing is he's collecting corpses of children from the battlefield and reanimating their flesh to create flesh for Hyakkimaru. And so, like, when Hyakkimaru pulls off his arm to, like, do the sword, it's an actual arm that is fleshy and bloody, and then it crawls back on and, like, reattaches, and there's a little CGI effect to show the arm coming back on, which on one level is just very gross and leads to a lot of, like, thematic checks I don't think the movie can quite cash. But also, why does he need his body parts? Because when he gets a body part back, nothing visibly changes about him. So that's weird. They also completely age up Dororo to an adult who is Hyakkimaru's age. I like the actress playing her. I think, like, they do attempt to keep her kind of, like, thieving, rebellious, like, personality from the original, and I think she's good at that. But it's an awkward movie. Like, I think the opening scene, like, their introduction to Hyakkimaru isn't like that scene in the field where he, like, fights 7 guys, which is the perfect opening for a live action movie because it's just a Kurosawa style scene, right? They don't do that. They have him fight a CGI spider monster in a bar, and it's really bad CGI. Like, none of the monsters seem to be done practically, and I think that's a shame. The movie is shot in flat widescreen, so 185:1, and in color. And I also think that's just, like, why is this not a widescreen movie? Why is it not in black and white? Like, there's just something about, like, Dororo gives you all of that. It gives you, like, embrace your inner Kurosawa, and it's more of kind of like a low budget it's got a lot of J-horror in it for the time. Like, it definitely feels more indebted to something like The Ring than it does, like, Tezuka or Tezuka's cinematic influences. And so it kind of turned me off, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not surprising to hear that. Like, there's just, like, seeing the cover to me really just made me not want to, I don't know, there's something about just seeing the 2 actors in costume on, like, the DVD or Blu-ray cover when I was considering buying it. I'm like, this just does not look like a Dororo that I want to watch. So, you know, maybe I'll check it out one day, but probably not. Who knows? Also in 2007, though, there was this is, like, very obscure. I almost overlooked this completely. There was I'd call this a spin-off manga just because it's a totally different story, but there is a quote-unquote spin-off manga called Dororo Bone, which was created by the mangaka Doi Daisuke, and it ran for 4 volumes. And I didn't read any of it. I just looked at the synopsis. But the synopsis is fucking wild. So the manga is about a reincarnated Hyakkimaru in... actually, this is a little bit wrong, I think, because it's not a reincarnated Dororo. I think it's just Dororo. And they're in modern-day Japan because Hyakkimaru, like, near the ending of what you would assume is kind of, like, more or less the story of the original Dororo, Hyakkimaru ends up getting killed by Dororo because Dororo gets possessed by a yokai. And as far as I could tell, like, she got possessed by yokai on purpose because she wanted to meet Hyakkimaru, because I think it's after Hyakkimaru leaves in the ending or something. But something happens and she ends up killing Hyakkimaru. And so Dororo, I think, is just Dororo who's lived as a yokai for, like, 500 years. And then Hyakkimaru is reincarnated as a woman. And they fight in, like, modern day Tokyo. I couldn't, not only did I not read it, I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find, like, a scan of it online. Maybe there's one out there. I didn't look super hard, but it seems weird. It's relatively obscure, but I would recommend, if you can find a synopsis online, to read through some of the synopsis, because it just seems fucking absolutely crazy and weird.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and this is wild. This is so weird. The most
tenuous connection to Dororo of any of the Dororo adaptations I've seen. And then we do have one last other adaptation before I get to 2019, which is in 2018, a new manga adaptation began, which is called The Legend of Dororo and Hyakkimaru, or Dororo to Hyakkimaru Den. And that is made by the mangaka Shiki Satoshi. This is still ongoing. So it has 11 volumes. It's still going. I kind of like skimmed through a scan of it, just to kind of look at it. And it seems to me a totally like reasonable adaptation of the original, like putting in a like new stuff. It's not like, word for word the same thing based on what I looked at, but it is trying to tell that story. It starts with Hyakkimaru in a field killing like 7 dudes. One interesting change very early on that I saw in the volume 1 that I was skimmed through is it does the thing that I assume this is the inspiration that the 2019 show had to do this, where it brings Biwamaru, or as I call him, Natoichi. So I think in my head, the blind dude who's basically Zatoichi, but he's not, so he's Natoichi. That guy is in the Bandai story in the same way he is in the new one, where they meet him for the first time, where he's been captured by Bandai and thrown in the same cell. So it's so identical that I assume that's just where the 2019 show got that idea, which of course they kind of bring that character, make him more central in the new show, in part because if Hyakkimaru can't talk, they need somebody who can talk to Dororo.
Yes.
So so it doesn't make as much sense to me why he's there in the manga. But I thought it was interesting that idea was kind of pulled from there. And it shows you that like some of the stuff in the 2019 show is very much them pulling various elements that some of these other adaptations had done and bringing some of that together into their own original adaptation.
And we should note that unlike some of the other versions you've been talking about, this manga, The Legend of Dororo and Hyakkimaru, is out in English from Seven Seas,
yes.
So you can go find it digitally or in print. And I was just looking through the first couple pages. The art is nice. It's not...
Yes.
It's not Tezuka, but you can see the influence. Like, you can see it pulling from the same kinds of, like, really stark black and white, like, movies and whatnot.
Yeah, it was that. I basically like kind of half read, half skimmed the first volume, and it was cool. Like the art was really cool. And again, it seems like a totally respectable adaptation. So if you're really into Dororo stuff and you want to see another good version, this seems like a cool other thing to seek out. Again, it's not finished. I'm curious I have no idea where the story has left off at the 11th volume. I'm curious like what the plan is for it to end. Maybe when it's done, I'll pick it up and read it because I'm curious. What do you do? Because that's the thing that everybody doing Dororo has to figure out. It was, what the fuck do you do? Because the original didn't have a proper ending, so how do you end it? And that brings us to our main feature for today, which is Dororo 2019. So, like I said earlier, I didn't find like a lot of like big behind-the-scenes interviews that were particularly interesting, because a lot of the behind-the-scenes interviews I found were a lot with the like producer side of thing. I didn't find a lot of in-depth stuff with the director and writer, which is normally where you get more juicy details. So I've only got like a few notes here, but let's roll through what some of this is. So the 2019 adaptation of Dororo began life in 2016 when the then CEO of MAPPA, or I guess, well, he is still the CEO, the then new CEO of MAPPA, Otsuka Manabu, and then the producer at MAPPA, Kimura Makoto, and then Twin Engine CEO Yamamoto Koji, they all kind of got together and began planning a series where they wanted to adapt a Tezuka thing, and because they wanted to work with Tezuka Productions, because they had done that with a couple of other things before in MAPPA's early life. Just some brief notes on MAPPA. I'm not going to give like the whole life story on that studio, but just a couple of things to kind of note for people who don't know a lot about the company. So MAPPA was founded by Maruyama Maso in 2011. Maruyama is an old head in the world of anime. He began in 1965 working at Mushi Productions until eventually he became one of the founding members of the studio Madhouse in 1972. And then in 1980, he became CEO of Madhouse, which he was up until he left to go found MAPPA. He left to make MAPPA in order to create Katabuchi Sunao's movie In This Corner of the World, which is a movie that he wanted to make in a long time, and just like they couldn't get it together. So it's like more or less he made the studio so that they could try to make it, and even then it took a long time. It was a fairly troubled production. That movie did eventually come out in 2016 to big critical acclaim. It won the Japanese Academy Award for Best Animated Movie of that year. But that's kind of like where MAPPA comes from. MAPPA's debut work of, their kind of like big first thing that actually came out, though, was the TV anime adaptation of Kids on the Slope, which that released in 2012. That's the like jazz anime. It's very good. And that was a co-production with Tezuka Productions. So MAPPA kind of began life working with Tezuka Productions on this show, which is like one of Tezuka Productions kind of trying to come back and make new stuff, because you didn't really see much new from that kind of whole studio. MAPPA then began ramping up production from there, producing on average about 2 to 3 shows a year until 2019. 2019, which is when Dororo comes out, is also kind of the turning point for MAPPA as a studio, where if you know of MAPPA, you probably think of MAPPA as the studio that makes every fucking anime, because in 2019 and from there on, they start making like 5 or 6 TV anime a year. They made 5 different TV anime just in 2019, and this is of course a studio that now, they're very famous for. They took on Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man at the same time, which is a kind of insane thing to do because they're 2 really big, complicated, expensive adaptations to make. And it's important to note, while I don't have any information on this specifically to 2019, MAPPA is very infamous today for being the studio that takes on lots of big, multiple high-profile projects at the same time. They also took over the Attack on Titan production from Studio Wit and stuff like that. So
they took over Attack on Titan. They took over Vinland Saga.
Yes.
They took on Hell's Paradise, and so they have a lot of adaptations that have started but not gone anywhere past 12 episodes.
Yes, and you'll note that all those things are not just popular shows, they're all complicated shows. They're not taking on they're making 5 rom-coms, which is a thing that's reasonable for a studio to potentially be able to do. These are all shows with big complicated action that are often fantasy or historical fiction like Vinland Saga. And so the other thing they're very infamous for, especially after Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, where there was a lot of this came out because of how intense the production of that show was, they are known for having very poor pay and very poor working conditions, that they do not pay their animators well, and they have very rushed production schedules. They tend to have, the end product tends to be fairly high quality most of the time, though you can oftentimes see edges, frayed edges, but that, of course, doesn't excuse them, working their workers to death, basically, and paying them shit rates compared to other studios. So again, I don't have anything specific to 2019 because most of that stuff became much more public post 2019. But I think it's reasonable to assume that it was happening at least to some extent at that point as well, because a lot of that started coming out, I think, more when Otsuka Manabu took over as MAPPA's CEO in 2015, I think is when that happened. And so, yeah, just think it's important to keep that in mind. This is a very different story from Kyoto Animation. But not just
they've basically tried to speed run a path to become the next KyoAni or Ufotable without spending the 20 years or whatever it took for those companies to build up the infrastructure and set of shows to be what they are,
Yeah, exactly. So when we have this Dororo 2019, it's coming in this phase of MAPPA turning into this thing that we think of it as today. Otsuka, this is where I put this note. So Otsuka took over as CEO from Maruyama in 2016, and he's the one who then really worked closely with the company Twin Engine to begin planning Dororo. Twin Engine, if you don't know, is a very large anime production company that they're on the producer side of things. And so they're funding and stuff like that. They have a bunch of subsidiaries, they keep on making more subsidiaries that are the actual anime production studios they often work with. The most famous of those would probably be Studio Kodoido. But they've got a whole bunch. They've got a dozen of them. And they keep on making more. So while Otsuka has been quoted as stating he wants MAPPA to become a studio in the same model of Kyoto Animation Ufotable, which we were just referencing, they are, and of course we're in 2019, a much more typical anime production studio, which outsources most of the work, including the major creative figures. And I have a later note that will expand on some of this. But in terms of those major creative figures, when they began planning Dororo, they approached 2 main people, or the 2 key figures who really are make the backbone of the show. You have your director, Furuhashi Kazuhiro, whom they hired primarily for his experience on multiple Jidaigeki anime, which of course, Jidaigeki meaning historical fiction. You often think of samurai, fits into that Jidaigeki genre, and he's most famous in that regard for being the director of the original Rurouni Kenshin anime and its various original OVA adaptations. And then the other person they approached was the writer Kobayashi Yasuko, whom they approached because they had worked with her on various other projects earlier, such as Gado, Kakegurui, and Attack on Titan. She's the writer for Attack on Titan, who maintained with that series across the studio switch. So she was both pre-MAPPA and post-MAPPA, was the writer for that series, or at least its adaptation. The show itself is a full co-production with Tezuka Productions, so it's not just MAPPA credited, it is Tezuka Productions credited as well for animation production. MAPPA is credited as animation production, basically being the lead for 17 of the episodes, and Tezuka Production is the lead for 8 of the episodes, and those are fairly evenly distributed throughout the series' run, though MAPPA does have the full kind of last sweep of episodes. 18 to 24 are all MAPPA episodes. And there's no pattern in terms of like quality I really identified when I looked at the episodes. You would never be able to know. Because again, all of the like real work is outsourced anyways, so I don't think it's really that important at the end of the day, but it is a co-production between the two studios. The anime itself was announced in 2018, and then it was released for 24 episodes, so 2 cours from January to June 2019. In conjunction with the anime, they did also make a stage adaptation, which was created and performed throughout March 2019. The script and direction for that stage adaptation, which again is the second stage adaptation for Dororo, which is the weirdest fucking series in the world, that this 4-volume manga somehow fucking 50 years later has a second theater adaptation. The person who did this was Nishida Daisuke, who is someone who, if you look at his credits, has done like dozens and dozens and dozens of various anime and game-based stage adaptations, and the script for that was overseen by the screenwriter for this series, Kobayashi Yasuko. But very notably, I think part of the kind of impetus for doing this is that the role of Hyakkimaru in the stage play is played by Suzuki Hiroki, who is the actor who does the voice in the show, and because he is a stage actor, he is not a voice actor. And so that was, I think, part of like the reasoning behind doing this, is to work with the theater production company he was a part of to bring that and have it released simultaneously. And you can see clips of it online. This one is very easy to find clips of, and it's cool, particularly because that dude, Suzuki Hiroki, just looks exactly like Hyakkimaru. Like he's like this very sort of slim, very handsome guy with very striking features. So when he puts on like the wig and the howdy and stuff like that, he just looks exactly like Hyakkimaru. It's pretty cool. The series released to substantial critical acclaim and very well loved. It received a judge's recommendation award at the 23rd Japan Media Arts Festival. So it didn't like win like the main award, but it was kind of recognized for being very good. Although this did not necessarily translate to Blu-ray sales, though by the time we're at 2019, Blu-ray sales are sort of a footnote in some ways with anime. But just to note it, because I did find the numbers, it's about 2,000 copies, a little less than 2,000 copies per volume in terms of Blu-ray sales, which, again, is kind of whatever this show released day and date streaming, regardless. It partnered with Amazon Prime in terms of the streaming, which is how I watched it originally in 2019. But obviously it was very well watched and well liked amongst the people who saw it.
It was popular enough to get a full dub and Blu-ray release here from Sentai, so clearly it had some muscle behind it.
Yep. All right, so let's go in a little bit in depth with the people behind the scenes that made it. So, like I said, the anime production company, it is MAPPA and Tezuka Productions in terms of the main two studios behind the scenes, but I'll talk about this more in depth in a little bit, but all of these people are freelancers, right? This is the modern world of anime production. This is not Kyoto Animation, is not what we're talking about here. So the director is Furuhashi Kazuhiro. He got his start as an animator, storyboard artist, and director on a lot of Takahashi Rumiko adaptations, which I feel like is something I say about every other person we talk about outside of Kyoto Animation on our podcast, because it's all people who start with Urusei Yatsura or Maison Ikkoku or Ranma 1/2. Those shows were just like a breeding ground for the 21st century of big anime creative figures, basically. His first turn as a full director was on the 1990 Ranma 1/2 Netto Uta Gassen OVA. And then later, he did the 1993 adaptation of the game Fatal Fury 2, the fighting game with like Terry Bogard. And that movie was called Fatal Fury 2, The New Battle. But then in 1996, Furuhashi directed the thing he is best known for, which is the original Rurouni Kenshin, and he was the chief director for both that show and its OVAs, which one of those OVAs is like extremely good and very, very well regarded. The other one, not so much. That's because they make weird story choices that are, I think, his domain. Furuhata has directed a wide range of other really acclaimed anime. He did the original 1999 version of Hunter x Hunter, which is very cool. I've never seen the original one all the way through, but it has such a cool fucking look to it. It's worth checking out. If you're a fan of Hunter x Hunter, you've only seen the new one, it's worth looking at some of that original version because it's pretty sick. He did.
You do sometimes hear from Hunter x Hunter fans who are like diehard about that and hate the second version, and yeah.
I think it's like it doesn't get to the points in the Hunter x Hunter manga that are the most interesting parts of the story, but it does the old stuff way better. It's a little bit similar to the Full Metal Alchemist slash Brotherhood divide, if that divide was actually the thing that people say it is based on their memory, rather than watching the original Full Metal Alchemist and missing the like episode 3 where they murder a dude, because Full Metal Alchemist goes off the rails early. That's my opinion. I haven't watched the shows recently. But anyways, some other anime he did, Le Chevalier d'Eon. He did Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn, which of course we've seen, and then season 1 of Spy Family. So he is like obviously like a very acclaimed director who has had really good work consistently since 1996. So, you know, he's just one of those guys who he just puts in really, really good work across obviously a wide range of genres, whether it's mecha, action, comedy, like he can kind of do it all. Then we've got our writer here, our series composition writer, which is Kobayashi Yasuko. Kobayashi has a wide-ranging writing career in both live action and animation. In live action, she has been the main writer on 5 different Super Sentai series and 3 Kamen Rider series, which is a lot, because those shows all have 52 episodes. You know, like that's a lot of fucking TV to write. And then also she did the 2004 live action Sailor Moon show, which I have never seen. I don't think it has a particularly great reputation, but she did that. In animation, she has been the main writer on several acclaimed anime, such as Shakugan no Shana, which is a really good kind of mid-2000s show I like. That's one I hadn't thought about in a long time, and I saw it, I'm like, that show was good. So I probably need to rewatch that. She also is, as I said earlier, the writer for Attack on Titan across its whole anime adaptation. She is the main writer for I believe she has done all of the modern adaptations of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and then also Kakegurui, which is another one of the MAPPA adaptations. That's the like sexy gambling show, is the easiest way to describe that. She will also come up again later in our Grand Tour of Anime because she was one of the lead writers in the original 1998 version of Yu-Gi-Oh! She wasn't like the main person, but she was one of like the main writing staff on that show, so she will come up again when we get to that one. But obviously someone who has like cool credits, and it's cool to see someone just being like, fuck it, I'm going to write like 500 episodes of Super Sentai stuff. That's pretty baller.
That's awesome.
In terms of
it makes me even more excited for that Yu-Gi-Oh show, actually, because she's a phenomenal writer when you look at that lineup. Holy crap.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of character design, there's 2 people credited for character design. So there's the quote-unquote original character designs. I would say put quotes around the original, because of course the original character designs would be Tezuka Osamu. But in terms of, they had the artist Asa Hiroyuki do like the kind of draft of this is what we want these characters to look like. He is a mangaka best known for the 20-volume series Tegami Bachi, and he did the original versions of the designs used for the show, which were then adapted. And there's some stuff of them, like, it seems like a big part of the early production of the show was, like the pre-production, was figuring out what look are we going for, like how much Tezuka do they want to put in there, and early on they did more kind of like a Tezuka-esque look, and then eventually they kind of went for this more modern, very sleek look, which I think is a smart choice, because they changed so much of the story. I think if like trying to aesthetically recall Tezuka too much would have just been even more distracting. But those designs were then adapted for the show by the character designer and chief animation director Iwataki Satoshi. Iwataki is an animator who's worked on a lot of stuff. He got started as an animator at Sunrise in the 1980s. He is credited for key animation on 11 episodes of Zeta Gundam and 10 episodes of Double Zeta, for instance. So he just worked on a lot of like the big Sunrise shows in the 80s. By the 2000s, he began working more as an animation director, and he was chief animation director on the show Ghost Hunt, which is an okay show, but is a really good-looking show from the mid-2000s. Like, that stands out a lot as just having a great aesthetic. And you can see a through line from that show to Dororo in terms of the way the characters move is very similar. It's got that very, like, sleek, kind of slightly more minimalistic kind of quality to it that allows for really sleek, like, action animation. He was also the chief animation director on season 1 of A Certain Magical Index. More recently, he has been deeply involved in multiple MAPPA productions post-Dororo. For example, he was one of the main animation directors on the MAPPA seasons of Attack on Titan, and then he was an action director on Jikokuraku or Hell's Paradise, which you mentioned earlier, which is very well regarded for its action. I haven't actually watched that show yet, but I know that people, you know, like think that the action is fantastic.
I'm kind of waiting to see if it actually gets finished, because that's not even a long manga, but we only have 12 episodes, and I'm like, I'll wait and see.
Exactly. I'm in the same boat on that one. Additionally, we have the woman, Oka Mariko. She is credited as chief animation director for 7 episodes in the second half. And she also has a prolific career in 21st century anime. Most notably, she's the character designer and chief animation director for the Jigoku Shoujo series, or also known as Hell Girl, And that also, I just put this note in here because that shares a lot of aesthetic similarity with Dororo as well. So if you've seen that show, it made sense to me. It's like, oh, she was one of the other people, kind of one of the defining people on the look of the show in terms of how the characters move. And you see a lot of that DNA from Hellgirl, which is not necessarily an action series, but it's just got that same kind of vibe to it. In terms of music here, we've got Ike Yoshihiro. Ike has primarily worked as a TV drama and anime composer since the mid-90s. He's composed soundtracks for a wide range of great series such as Blood, the Last Vampire, Sonic X, Superior Defender Gundam Force, which is the Cartoon Network one. That's not a great show, but I just want to throw it in there because every time I see that show, I'm like, right, that thing exists. Ergo Proxy, Tiger and Bunny, and Kuroko's Basketball. And also, for this one's for you, Jonathan, Yu-Gi-Oh! The Dark Side of Dimension. I don't know if that's one of the good Yu-Gi-Oh! Things or not, but...
That actually is. That's the one Kazuya Takahashi came back for, or Kazuki Takahashi came back for and wrote the story, and it's kind of like it's kind of like what Toriyama did on the later Dragon Ball movies, came back and wrote an original story in the manga continuity, and that is the last thing he wrote for Yu-Gi-Oh! Before his death. So that is one of the good ones. It's weird. It's Kaiba basically tries to get space aliens to help him beat Yugi. It's crazy. It's bizarre. He builds a whole space station to learn how to duel better. It's nuts. My other note here, Sean, is do we have to add a Sonic X episode to this season? Because it has come up in every single episode we've recorded for season 5 of this show, and I feel like I got the Blu-ray sitting right over here. Is Sonic X like this hidden masterpiece that everybody worked on? We need to talk about it.
Yeah, maybe we just, we could do a whole Sonic season where we just look at all the Sonic cartoons, the only one of them is Japanese, but, but all of them are Japanimation.
Japan.
Exactly. Yeah. They're all Japanimation one way or the other, whether it was a lead or not. But yes, you are right. Like, everybody seemingly worked on Sonic X. It is very weird. It's why I keep on putting it in my notes when I see it pop up, because I'm like, it keeps on fucking popping up. But also... he is the composer of choice for very strange Gundam Western co-productions, because he is the composer not just for the Cartoon Network co-production Superior Defender Gundam Force, he also is the composer for the live-action movie G-Savior, the Canadian co-production, which I'm not going to hold that against him, I don't remember the music one way or the other. But this dude has worked on like 100 fucking things. Like, I'm just pulling out things whose names I recognize, but he's worked on everything. And then that's kind of like where really the main production stuff stops, because I was going to go through and do episode director and storyboard stuff. I'll mention a couple people here, but it became clear to me very quickly that it's sort of futile to do that with this kind of show, and I'll mention why in a little bit. But some of the main episode director / storyboard credits that jumped out to me, you of course have the main director Furuhashi Kazuhiro, who does this for the first and last episode. You also have Kobayashi Osamu, who he does this for episode 15, which that's one of the Sabame ones with the moth lady. But also more notably, he does this for the first ending, which I think is kind of why they worked with him. Because Kobayashi, he's unfortunately passed away. He's a notable illustrator and designer who began directing in the 2000s, and he's directed like a lot of very stylized stuff. A lot of it themed around music. So series like Beck, Paradise Kiss, and Some Days Dreamers. He also did notable work on the Naruto franchise, including being a guest director on Naruto Shippuden for episodes 480 through 483. And then he did the concept art and helped define the look for the last Naruto the movie. It's important to try to understand what that title is. It's the last Naruto the movie. It's not the last Naruto movie. It's the last Naruto the movie. But yes, he passed away from cancer in 2021, but he's, again, like a very notable illustrator and designer. And so I suspect they worked with him more for the ending 1 stuff and then brought him back for episode 15, because he's more notable for opening and ending animation kind of stuff. And then one of the other people whose names jumped out to me was Sawai Koji. He did the storyboards for episode 12. I just wanted to shout about because he's a really prolific episode director. In particular, he's one of the main dudes behind the Dot Hack franchise, which is obviously a cool thing. So I want to throw that out there. But the reason why it became futile very quickly when I was looking at episode director and storyboard artist stuff is that this just isn't really that kind of show. So I just want to point out kind of how different a modern anime production is from the sort of thing we often talk about on this podcast. Because this is not a show that is mostly made in-house by employees of MAPPA or whatever. That's just not it. It's almost every single person on the show is a contractor who is either a freelancer or who works for a subcontracting studio. So the top line creative figures, every single person I just named, none of them are employees of MAPPA. So all of them came on, they were hired separately to work on this project, to become part of the production committee for this project specifically. They are not MAPPA employees. So none of the storyboard artists, there are 21 storyboard artists that worked on the show, none of them are MAPPA people. There are 15 episode directors. None of them are MAPPA people. There are 4 writers on the show. None of them were MAPPA people. There are 4 chief animation directors. None of them were or are employees of Studio MAPPA. Also, there were, just to like kind of illustrate a little bit of what we're talking about in terms of these productions, there are so many people who touched this kind of show compared to something like a Kyoto Animation show or almost anything else we've talked about. There were 41 people credited in the role of animation director, which is that role below chief animation director. There's 41, which is a fucking lot. And then I went through and I counted. This took a little bit to do, but I just wanted to see it through because I was curious. And it was just a little hard because you had to like look for a lot of duplicates because lots of companies worked on multiple roles. I counted how many different companies are credited as working on the show, and there were 105 different companies credited with the direct production of the show. So this is not like people who do the localization or the subtitles. This is not the marketing team. None of that. These are people who are doing animation, editing, sound design, music production, right? The nitty gritty of making the show. 105 different companies were involved in that process. Just for reference, counting it the same way I did for this. For Violet Evergarden, which I know has half the episode count, but it's the most recent, like, notable, very gorgeous Kyoto Animation show that has, like, complicated action animation, stuff like that. That show had 14 companies versus the 105. And Dragon Ball GT, which we covered earlier in the show, this one, there's a chance, because it's an older show, that not everything was like perfectly credited, but it's not so old that I would think that there's anything a huge discrepancy there. I was able to find 27 different companies that worked on Dragon Ball GT, because of course most of the people who worked on that show were employees of Toei Animation, because Toei Animation employs a huge number of people. So it's just important to keep in mind when we're talking about this kind of show is that it is not going to be your like Kyoto Animation. All of these people are like this like big team that has worked together on dozens of different shows, right? This is a team that was built for this show. They made this show, and then they all went off to go do different stuff. And that's just the reality of what anime production is post, like the 2010s, basically.
Yeah, it's stark to see it laid out like that. But as you say, that's not, I mean, I think for MAPPA, sometimes it's particularly extreme, as we have talked about, because of the amount of stuff they take on. But this is more the norm for your big anime productions these days.
Yes, that is not unusual for like any random show you're going to be watching. Obviously, some stuff that's like kind of lower budget and simpler is not going to hit over 100 different people working on it. But anything that's like slightly more complicated is going to start hitting those numbers, just because it's not how most studios handle animation production today, because there's so many shows being made, and the production is just so widely distributed across so many different people. So it's just interesting when you like look at it, how different it is, and how far away Studio MAPPA is from that thing that Otsuka, the CEO, said of, he's like, I want to make my own Kyoto Animation. It's like, you got a long fucking road ahead of you, bro, because like you're not there. You're very much not there yet. Yeah. Yes. So do you want to talk about the openings and endings now, Jonathan, or do that later?
Let's talk about it now, because here's the thing. This show has such good openings and endings that they got fucking Asian Kung Fu Generation to do a brand new original song, and it's my least favorite of these 4. And that is not because I think it's a bad song. It's good. It could be a Naruto opening, or it could be a Full Metal Alchemist opening. It sounds a little more generic to me. But these are really great openings and endings, particularly, I think, Cayenne Fire by Queen Bee, the first opening, is just iconic, like so good, like would have been in contention for like my top 10 anime openings if we'd done that list after I'd seen this show. Unbelievable.
Yeah, that one was in consideration for me. It's one of the ones I thought about when we did that top 10 anime openings podcast. Yeah, so all 4 of these are phenomenal. This is definitely that like 00 Gundam kind of anime where you just feel like they went really hard to try to get really good people to make the openings and endings, because I mean all these bands are and were big. I was like, Queen Bee was a little bit new in 2019, but they had done some popular stuff, and they're very, very big now. And yeah, Cayenne Fire, the first opening, it's incredible. Both the music and the animation together is just phenomenal. There's so much great stuff. in that one. I love they have that little like sound of like the wood hitting the rock from that like the water feature or whatever that's common in Japanese like water gardens. And when it synced with that sound, you have that little thing of Dororo tapping her head and she turns into like the Tezuka looking Dororo. Like that's a great visual. Dororo standing in the field with her like hands clasped in prayer with like this giant phantasmic flaming horse, which obviously is kind of you realize is Midoro once you get all the way to the end of the show.
Well, no. That's actually a direct panel from the manga. That's a panel from the Tale of Misery chapter. It's the opening page.
Oh, right.
And it's where you go into the flashback is Dororo like praying, and it's these like flaming horses going by. That is one of my favorite shots in this whole show. Forget that it's in the theme song, because it's such a beautiful recreation of that. One of the best panels Tezuka ever drew, and it's so good. I love the main guitar lick in this song when it comes in full, and it's that incredibly fluid animation of Hyakkimaru just cutting up demons, and in the rain. That's incredible. Just the fact that you boot up this historical, Jidaigeki samurai show, and it starts with "Party is over," and you're like, what? It's like, it's not the song you expect for Dororo at all, and it's so good. And I love when you boot up a show, and it's not the theme song you would think this show would have, but it's the perfect theme song for the show. That's great.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And then you have our first ending theme paired with that one. And this is probably my favorite song in the show, is Sayonara Gokko, which means playing at goodbye or like pretending to say goodbye. And this is by the artist Amazarashi, whose stuff I really, really like. This is also the one that is like the most famous from this show. It was like a very, very popular and big hit song. It charted at number 7 on the Oricon charts and number 4 on iTunes in Japan when it came out. All the other ones did fine, but this one, like, none of the other ones broke in the top 10 on those charts. And Sayonara Gokko just is this is just like a fucking great song in its own right, but also like, I like the lyrics and the way they that notion of playing at and trying and pretending to say goodbye. Like it with all the things of the people that these characters have to say goodbye to and kind of like hide themselves a little bit under that pain. I don't know, just like it fits the themes of the show incredibly well.
Yeah, and the animation for that one is beautiful because it's these very like textured, almost concept art-esque images of the characters. So Dororo, I should say, it's the first anime I've watched in full on my new OLED TV, which is the same OLED TV you have. And so my impression of just how good Dororo looks might be inflated by that fact, but I do think this show looks great. It makes great use of color, and like the texturing on that ending on an OLED screen is like demo-worthy material. It like really looks phenomenal. Although I also love the animation for the second ending, Yamio by Eve, which is all these blurry images that frankly at some point, I'm at CU Boulder, I teach avant-garde film, I know this maybe is off base. It feels like it's an homage to Stan Brakhage at certain points of the kinds of, like, if you've seen his animated works where he painted directly on film cells, that's what it looks like in parts, and it's really cool. It's one of the more experimental-ish anime endings I've ever seen. Yeah,
the song there is fantastic. And yeah, the aesthetic where it's I feel like it's communicating the sort of like blurred and indistinct way which Hyakkimaru perceives the world. I like that way, and how it like kind of artistically expresses that is great. And then of course you have the second opening theme, which is just titled Dororo, just make Googling this series even more confusing, because there's like 100 things that are just called Dororo. But this is our Asian Kung Fu Generation song. I kind of agree with what you said, that it's a great song. It's like, it would be fantastic as an opener for like kind of any of the series that you think of, if you think of Asian Kung Fu Generation. But it is probably like in some ways the weakest of the 4 songs here, but it's so good in its own right. And this also has a lot of really great visuals, particularly the kind of last parts of the song where you get that montage of Dororo and Hyakkimaru kind of traveling around the world, or I guess traveling around Japan, the ending with the shot of Hyakkimaru reaching out and cradling Dororo's face, and then it going into his eyes, and his clouded eyes having like that brief look of like them coming back and him seeing. Is just a very like touching moment that of course is like this, seeing that image built up in the ending over and over again makes it so once you get to that point in the last few episodes where some of that imagery gets evoked again in the actual show, I think is very powerful.
Yeah. I think the only real critique of this song is that despite being called Dororo, it feels the least specific to this show. It feels like it feels like a mid-2000s anime opening that could have been on any number of shows from that era. And that's not a critique, because we like that era of anime openings here at Japanimation Station. We are pro-Asian Kung Fu generation doing, cool, badass anime openings. But, I think if you played this song for me in 5 years, I don't know if I would remember it's from Dororo. If you play me Fire in 20 years, I'm going to remember it's from Dororo. That is a Dororo song.
Although if they play it for you and you're like, what's the song again? And they say it's Dororo, then you will remember that it was from Dororo. So,
yes.
It's pretty...
But they don't say Dororo, at least in the 90-second version, so...
No, I don't think they do in the full version either.
Yeah.
Though the lyrics, if you pay attention to the lyrics, they are very much written for the show. Like, it's like the song is written from Hyakkimaru's perspective, which is very touching. That one also, if you go online... if you want to see an incredibly fucked up music video, you should see the actual, the live action music video for it. It's fucking weird as shit. It's some Human Centipede, crazy bullshit. It's like a horror movie. It's weird. It's kind of like an extension of that aesthetic from the very beginning of the opening, where Hyakkimaru is lying and his body is kind of ripped apart and it's being eaten by maggots, basically, which is a very gross look. It's a little bit closer to that aesthetic, but it's very strange.
I'm looking at it now, and I see what you mean, and yeah. Well, they're Asian Kung Fu generation. They can do whatever the fuck they want, but wow.
Yeah, it's weird because, I just stumbled on it because I just wanted to listen to the song, and it's a music video, I'll look at that. And I kept on waiting for the aesthetic of it to shift out of sight of this, sort of Saw horror movie kind of look it has, and it never does. That's the whole music video looks like that. Even when the song moves out of that kind of heavier tone, which it does in the chorus, it's no, you're still looking at a weird slug person. It's very weird. There is one more song though. There is technically an insert song here, which I want to mention just because it took me a while to figure out where the song came from. So there's the song Akai Hana Shiroi Hana, or Red Flower, White Flower, which is sung by the character Mio, performed by her voice actress Mizuki Nana. She sings it in both episodes 5 and 6. This is, of course, the song that Hyakkimaru, just having gained the ability to hear, it's the only thing that can calm him down. And you would just probably assume that this is an old Japanese folk song that's been around for hundreds of years, but you would be wrong, because this song is a song that's been around since the 1970s, because it is a song originally written by the artist Nakabashi Mie, and it is a favorite of for cover artists. Every popular group at some point has done a cover of Akai Hana Shiroi Hana. There's 100 covers of this song, and it was particularly became famous in the 1970s as different folk rock bands came to the song and did covers of it. But it's that kind of song that it's impossible to find what the fuck is the first version of the song. You just can't do it. There's so many different covers, and the original version is so kind of buried under that. And I just thought, I went under a weird research rabbit hole trying to track down what the fuck the song was, and that's what I came up with.
Nice. Yeah, I did. I would have thought that was written for the show or something, because it sounded specific enough to what's going on in the episode. So that's cool. And I guess it is. They picked the song and then animated the episode around it. But yeah.
Yes, but that's where that song comes from. Thanks for listening to Japanimation Station. If you're enjoying the show, please remember to like and subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and tell your friends.
You can also find us over at the Purely Academic Podcast, our potentially educational variety show where we talk video games, movies, TV, and more every month. And you can read my movie reviews and follow everything we release together on the Fade to Lack Substack at www.jonathanlack.com.
And now, back to the show.
Well, I guess now we get to talk about Dororo, Sean. Again. The 2019 Dororo anime, now that you've given us the full history. Where do you want to start with breaking this show down?
There's a few places we can go. So I've kind of looked at, if we want to go into the storyline, when I looked at it, I think you can pretty clearly break the show down into 6 episode chunks. It's very clearly broken into fourths. So we can go there, or we can talk about the characters. I'll let you, Jonathan, kind of pick. Where does your mind first take us here?
Well, let's do some overall thoughts about it, and let's can return to our conversation from the beginning of the episode, I guess, is where we should start. Because I do think I want to stress again, I think this is a good show. I don't have any, like, this is, like, bad. I don't think it's an affront to Tezuka, any of that. My critiques are more on that level of we're engaging with something that is a serious, clearly work of art and has a lot of ideas, and so that's where we're coming from at it. And again, I do think, like, I also think it's very watchable. Like, I breezed through these episodes. It's very easy to watch through. It looks gorgeous. You know, the episodes play pretty well. Back to back. Like, I did the last 6 in one sitting, and it was like a very easy viewing, kind of like you're watching a movie almost, you know. So there was no problems with any of that. And it is certainly a more consistent show than Dororo 1969, but kind of just automatically, because it was made as one show with a coherent vision start to finish. It did not get rebooted halfway through or anything like that. But I did think, like, for me, it lacked the highs of the other versions of the Dororo story, other than some of the stuff with Hyakkimaru, who I do think, like, their interpretation is very firm, it's very interesting, it's very committed. It threw me for a loop a little bit at first, but in a way that I eventually, like, grew to really like, because, I mean, if you've read the other versions, it is very different. Like, their take on Hyakkimaru is much more... Realistic is a weird word to apply to a scenario where it's about a guy who's getting his body parts back from demons, but it is trying to think more like in a grounded sense of what it would be like to move through the world without limbs, without skin, without the ability to see or hear or any of these things. There's the whole, like, color of spirits he sees. And so all of that, like, I think that side of it, that characterization, the way they maximize the as you said last time, Sean, the just solid gold concept Tezuka came up with, which I think if there's 2 reasons why Dororo has endured as long as it has, and I think one is that is just an irresistible concept of there's a samurai who gets his body parts back when he defeats yokai. That is evergreen. That will always be a great idea for a story, and there's always going to be different ways to tell it. And the second reason is it's unfinished. So there's always going to be new ways to tell it, because we don't know how Tezuka would have ended it. I think the 69 anime feels closer, like, to where he would have gone, and it was under his auspices to some degree, but we don't know. So everybody can have a point of view on it. And I think those 2 reasons have continued, and I think on those 2 factors, this show comports itself well. I do want to start with the characterization of Dororo herself, because it's interesting. I think the first thing I want to say is I do think the actor, and we'll talk about them in a second, Suzuki, is that Ryo? Yeah, Suzuki Ryo. Yeah. It's a very Studio Ghibli-esque performance, as we mentioned last time. It's a very, not that she's not an actor, but not the kind of actor you would normally get for this part in an anime. So it's a very, like, unmannered performance, and I like that. It also is a place, and I think it's representative of some other things where I think they, to me, went a little too far in their direction of grounded for this show, is that they've taken away a lot of Dororo's humor. They've almost completely taken away the aspect of her being a thief. They've taken away the hot-headedness. They've taken away, like, that she runs off and gets into trouble. You know, like, when they do the demon sword story, she doesn't try to take the sword just gets her, which, like, completely removes her agency in the story. There's stuff like that where I think the character has become a lot flatter, literally, in that the swings between the sides of her personality are much smaller. And I think as a result, it feels like there's less of a coming-of-age thing going on here. Like, when they get to the Shiranui story, that is the biggest story in the manga past Banmon, and it's the one where Dororo starts having, like, real agency in the plot in terms of, like, solving problems, not creating them. And that contrast doesn't exist in this version of the show, other than she's not with Hyakkimaru, because she's been competent and leading things ever since, or since the beginning of the show. And I that just felt, especially near the home stretch, where I feel like the last episode, the drama around Hyakkimaru is really good, and Dororo feels like a complete afterthought in terms of how the story wraps up, and it doesn't have that same punch that I felt at the end of the 69 version. And so that's just one area where I like the little moments in the theme song where they do Tezuka designed Dororo, but it also feels like a little bit of a pain in my chest of, like, well, why can't she be a little more like that? Like, I understand to the full cartoony degree that she is in 69, that's not a character that you could do in this setting. But there's just, like I said, a general flatness that I also see in, for instance, how little we see of communities along the way, how stories get a lot more compressed and get, like, mystery taken out of them. You see this in the Fair Fudo story, for instance, where things just kind of happen in front of the characters. We don't have a general sense of unraveling the mystery. And there just is a little bit of flatness around the non-Hyakkimaru parts that bothers me.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. And obviously, I think part of the thing here is just we have come this from opposite directions. Because for me, this is what Dororo was. And so my frame of reference is I'm comparing... And obviously, this is like lessened since I watched this 5 years ago, and then I read the manga. So it's like, it's not as strong in that sense. But still, my primary frame of reference is the story of Dororo is what this show is, and then I go back and I compare the original to it. And I think for me, it's a thing where I think the two series are trading strengths and weaknesses because they have different emphases. And I think you're right that like Dororo is definitely a flatter and less interesting character, but Hyakkimaru is a more dynamic and more interesting character than the original. I think they have like switched those two things. And not to say that like I think there is more they could have done with Dororo, and I think that's right. I think it is like when you get near the end, Dororo's role gets so pushed off to the side where she's still important in the sense that she is the only character that has kind of learned the lesson of the story, right? She's the person who's able to vocalize when all these other adults are trying to debate like going the path of the Shura or the Buddha and what is it to sacrifice people and all this kind of shit. Dororo is the only person because she's the only one who has seen what this world is actually like, who can refute their points and give them like, this is what I have learned by seeing the path that my Aniki has walked. And that's very much what the character is. It's like she's a character that learns through seeing Hyakkimaru, and she is the character that can kind of give voice and express that. And I do wish that they had a little bit more, especially for her, especially because in the original anime, that character is so dynamic and so fun and so alive because of how much that voice actress in particular gave like power to that original characterization of Dororo. But at the same time, I understand why the show does what it does because I see where it's trying to like alter its emphasis because you need to give oxygen for these other things that they have inserted into the show that didn't exist in the original version. And so like these kinds of pieces are moved around. The thing that I do really like about this version of Dororo, just the like kind of the thing that this version does bring, is there is a legitimate childishness to the character that I think is very effective. Not the sort of like expressive, like cartoonish childishness that the original version has, but partially because you have an actual child actor playing her, also because of her design and the way she's written. The ways that she reacts to the world feel very kind of like real, and there's a like, I think it's partially because I also just work with kids. There's this just like, it just like pulls at me that like there's this, I want to like her to be safe and like see her grow and develop and learn. And there's a kind of an adorableness to her that is very different in this like very real kind of precocious child kind of way that I think gives this version of Dororo a flavor that the original does not have.
Well, and here's the thing, I agree and I like that, and that's why I want more. Like, it's why I use the word flat and not like bad or boring, because I don't think that's the case. I think it's a good basic characterization. I like the voice, I like what you're talking about. I just think there could be more activity in it. Like, just to give a more concrete example, like with like around the Shiranui plot, for instance, one thing we do know about Tezuka's longer term plans for Dororo, had he been able to continue it, is that he wanted to move more in a direction of it becoming a coming of age story for her. That's why past Banmon, the story moves to be more about Dororo for a while. It's where you get the plot that is not in the 69 show, but is in this one, with the treasure map on her back. Just the fact that she is a girl is introduced at that point in the story, in the manga. All of those things. They do technically adapt it here, but I think it's funny that they don't actually go further than Tezuka went with it. Like, they do go, they introduce the map, they do the Shiranui story. It's like a lot of it, it's a pretty softened version of the story. And it also winds up getting caught in Hyakkimaru's gravity because it becomes about Tahomaru and one of his many failed Saturday morning cartoon villains' attempts to kill Hyakkimaru. And you get through all of that, and the Dororo and the treasure side of it is just kind of put a pin in until at the very end of the show. And I do just wish, like, all the pieces are there if they'd wanted to build on it a bit more. And because those themes of poverty and the need for societal betterment and like what do we sacrifice are there, I think there's a really clear opportunity in how you could have tied Dororo into the action of the climax more, in that money wouldn't just be the thing that at the very end she's like, this is how we build a new community. If there was, like, Dororo in the 69 anime helps like the whole uprising in the finale. And I wish there was something of like Dororo having a role to tie in her side of things, her legacy, this money her parents lent her, with the larger themes that the show is engaging with at that point. And that is, like, probably my single biggest criticism of the show is around that stuff.
Yeah, and I agree. Like, I think that you could have done, like, they could have done more to build up her role in a larger way in that climax. And I do think there's, like, a couple of places where, like, I think they could have, this is sort of like a cliche thing, but it's a cliche for a reason. You know, they're doing their whole buddy story. That's, like, very much part of, like, the thing they do here. That's, I guess, technically in the original, but it's not in the same way. And part of, like, the sort of cliche of the buddy story is they get separated, not just because of circumstances, but because of some, like, true rift that becomes driven between them. And they never really push that to, like, a big breaking point, right? Like, so, like, when Dororo goes to the island, or the cape or whatever, to get the treasure, that's just because she gets kidnapped by Itachi, right? It's not a thing where she chooses to leave Hyakkimaru. Their, like, relationship is put at a huge stress point, and it's like it's near a breaking point, but they don't actually have it be a breaking point. And I think, like, it probably would have been stronger if they had pushed that a little bit more, which I think would have given Dororo more room to then grow as a character in response.
It's also a problem I have in the second half of the show of just how much time is spent talking around whether Hyakkimaru is doing the right thing by violently killing all the demons, but, like, nothing comes of it. Like, Dororo doesn't actually ever leave his side because of that. No, like, there's not a, like, big character rift, as you're saying, or any, like, major consequence until, like, actually grappling with it at the very end when he chooses not to kill Tahomaru and spares Daigo. And, like, so there's a thematic repetition to that bothers me, that intersects with this flatness in the relationship, where there's an obvious, because I actually believe in the chapter in the manga, the separation in Shiranui is that Dororo is mad for some, now it's an episodic thing, but there is, like, Dororo is a more active character who will just storm off sometimes, and that is not the case here. Like, I think I have a lot of affection for Dororo in this show through Hyakkimaru, like, as your point of contact character, and I wish I felt a little, like, I also think that there's a little bit of a lack of seeing Hyakkimaru through Dororo's eyes and what she gets out of that relationship that I think a Rift story also would have highlighted for us.
Yeah, and I think if, like, I have one major criticism of the show, I think that's fundamentally what it'd be. Or, like, there's just a couple of one-off stories that I think are, like, kind of whatever. That's actually my biggest criticism of the show. The other thing would be this, that, like, I think they could have just taken the Dororo element and pushed it even further. That being said, though, again, it's like, I think that criticism, though, like, becomes far more clear in juxtaposition with the original. I think it's a lot harder to see if you're looking at the show in isolation. It's, like, not as kind of potent a flaw, but it is when you're comparing it with its source material, it is this thing where they have made certain compromises in order to introduce original elements into this version, and maybe, like, some of that balance is lost a little bit, where you could have still had some, like, a lot of what they do with the new stuff and still preserved some of what the original was doing with the Dororo character, and had that not just work, but have all the new elements work even better. And I think that that's a totally fair point.
So, Sean, that's Dororo. We agree. More mixed on that character. Hyakkimaru, I do think we're going to be in lockstep on. This is a great characterization. Again, I have some issues with some of the theming and repetition around the character in the plot arc, but the character itself, like, this is a really great interpretation of Hyakkimaru, and I think leaning as hard into their ideas as they do and really making it so core to those show's whole style and approach to storytelling, in leaning into the idea of him not being able to see, not being able to talk, at certain points not being able to feel, and I don't think it's a problem in the Tezuka version that they kind of gloss over that stuff, because there's other things it's interested in, but here it becomes so key to the show, and because this is a modern anime that can be more expressive with its animation, it's more sensory. It's a sensory experience, and that's who Hyakkimaru is for us, as someone regaining their senses and their sense of humanity, and it's just done really well.
I mean, it's a character who doesn't talk or make any vocalizations until the end of episode 5, and then doesn't, like, start speaking sentences until, like, the midpoint of the show. And so much of the character in the first half is just a purely physical, quote unquote, physical performance through the animation that, that would be a hard if not impossible, thing to do in 1969 with limited animation techniques to communicate what this character does. Yeah, so this is where, like, you know, if we were recording this podcast 5 years ago and it was me fresh off of having watched this show and then I went straight into reading the manga, we would have just had the reverse version of that conversation about Dororo, because, like, imagine how shocking it is going from this version of Hyakkimaru to, like, Batman Hyakkimaru in the original, who's a superhero, you know, who's like, where in that original, and again, I don't think this is not a thing, me criticizing the original to say that it's bad. It's just how shocking the difference is, because the emphasis is in such a different place. But when you're used to the idea of this story is about the idea of a character who is trying to rebuild their humanity through violence and like complications of what that is. And it's like both metaphorically, but also very literally about that. And like that metaphor is expressed through the literal action of the story. And then you move into one where that's still basically the character, but it's entirely metaphorical. Like, yes, technically there is exposition that says, I've got psychic powers, so when I move my lips, your mind is just hearing the things I want you to hear. Like, sure, you have the exposition, but like, the idea that this person has had their humanity ripped from them is like an idea. It's not actualized in the way the character exists in the story, which again is totally fine, but it is a fucking culture shock when you go and you're like, what the fuck? Oh my God. Like, he's just like Batman or something. He is written as like this superhero character, especially in the anime, the original anime, in the second half, where he just becomes the dude who comes in to fight the demon at the end. It's just such a different vision for him.
Yeah, because I think the vision in the Tezuka version of the story, which just broadly encompassing the 60s tellings, is that he's our tour guide through hell. That's who Hyakkimaru is. He is, because Dororo is much more the main character of that version of Dororo, and certainly more of a POV, I think would be fair to say. And Dororo is this, like, because like Dororo in that version would not have survived long into that story, because like the world is hell and everyone is dying. Partners up with Hyakkimaru and is able to kind of like get through, because this is this person who has kind of mastered hell. He has like fallen, almost like a fallen angel or something, and he's building himself back up through this, you know, hellish landscape. And of course there are like serious grapplings with humanity along the way. The 69 anime in particular ends on basically the same thematic note this version ends on. It just gets to it obviously in a very different direction. But yeah, like it is obviously the emphasis is so different, because here Hyakkimaru is at the beginning more of a child than Dororo in a lot of ways. And by the end in some ways too, is someone who is just starting to figure out, like, has had their humanity so stripped from them. And it obviously makes real this idea that is core to the themes of the show of what does a society sacrifice when it builds its excess on an underclass, right? When it builds its comfort on an underclass, and it makes the idea of someone who isn't even able to be a full person very literal. And as he takes more and more of that back, then the questions of what does it mean to be a person, from the very basic sensory stuff of what does it mean to feel someone, get to know someone, do I rub my forehead against theirs to get to know them, you know, what is it, onto at the very end of deciding what to do with Daigo, which is probably my favorite scene, honestly, in this version of Dororo. Is I think that is like the stick the landing moment where they tell that version of the story. But yeah, it's great. I think Suzuki Hiroki, the two Suzukis were not related, right?
No, it's just Suzuki is the most common surname in Japan. Like, Suzuki Taichi is the Japanese version of John Doe. So it just coincidentally, Dororo and Hyakkimaru are both voiced by two totally unrelated Suzukis.
I could see them having gone for like a, you know, brother-sister coupling for this kind of casting if they'd wanted to, but that is not what they did. But yeah, Suzuki Hiroki, like, it's a great performance. In that second half, look, Sean, you and I have watched a lot of anime. We've heard a lot of anime yells. Hyakkimaru's anime screams in this show are unlike any other anime screams I've ever heard, because they feel more, not just guttural, but they feel like someone who hasn't used their voice letting it burst forth. And I don't really know how to describe that effect other than that. It's like someone yelling who doesn't know how to yell. And when that happens and you get those moments, like, oh my gosh, it's a powerful performance.
Yeah, it's definitely like the star performance of the show, which is funny for somebody again who's in every episode but doesn't say anything until the end of episode 5.
Well, I don't think are they even credited in the first couple episodes, because I think Dororo is the top credit at the beginning, and then once Hyakkimaru gets his voice back, Suzuki Hiroki becomes the top credit. But I don't think he's even listed because he has no lines.
Yes, because it's like not only does he not say anything, he can't vocalize anything at all. So there's no efforts, there's no like like none of that there. But yeah, so it's like it's such a great performance because it's you're asking this actor to do something that like actors will almost never do. It's such a strange ask of a performance, which I think is one of the reasons why it makes sense for this character to also go with a non-traditional voice actor, because Suzuki Hiroki is a stage actor, like almost completely stage actor. He's been in a couple movies and TV shows, but he is in like dozens and dozens and dozens of plays, and he's mostly the main character. So it's like he's a big actor on stage, and I think that just like it's interesting that you have, for both of the main characters, you have them cast non-voice actors, but I think for but not totally different reasons, but two fairly different reasons. For Dororo, you're going for an actual child actor, which makes perfect sense for the version of the character they're going for. And, no child is a voice actor. Like they might be an actor, but they're not a voice actor versus a stage actor. Like they're just, a child actor. And so you're going there. And then for Hyakkimaru, like, I don't think there's any reason to go for a voice actor over any other kind of actor, because you're asking this actor to just do something that no other actor is trained to do. Like, no voice actor has gone through training to try to play this character. And there is something about the, like, rawness and kind of relative inexperience and lack of practice at voice acting that the performance has that I think is really important for the character, that he doesn't have, as you're saying, this like super refined voice that feels like it's been fine-tuned through like art and practice, which is what professional voice actors have done. It's someone who's just trying to express like the rawness of the character, and he just happens to only be able to do it through the voice because of the circumstances of what the production is. But I think getting a talented stage actor to do that, I think, is just a really interesting casting choice that they just worked out so well, because he just, he embodies that character through all of his transformations. And that's what this show is about. Like, that's the glue of this show, is seeing Hyakkimaru's development. It is technically an episodic show in terms of its structure, where most episodes are standalone episodes, particularly in the first half. You get a couple of two-parters. In the second half, you get more multi-episode arcs. But generally speaking, while it's technically episodic, it doesn't feel like a super episodic show, because the development of Hyakkimaru is so clear and progresses so well. Every single episode, something changes about him as a person. Something grows. Either he literally gains something new, or he, something about him evolves as a person. And so that just makes that experience you're talking about of being super watchable, this very smooth experience of you just want to see what's going to happen with him next. How is he going to change next? How is he going to develop as a person? And I think that's the magic sauce of this version of Dororo. Like, that's what I think the whole concept of this show is all centered around this idea of how you execute Hyakkimaru as a character. And I think they absolutely nailed it.
100%. And it's kind of funny because around the middle of the show, you get, I think it's the Banmon two-parter is the first time he doesn't get a body part back from defeating a demon. And I had several things that annoyed me about their take on Banmon, and we'll talk about that later. But I'm like, oh man, does every Dororo just fall into this pattern where eventually they forget to give him body parts back? Because the manga and the 69 anime both do that at various points, and it's weird. But then they make it a plot point, and there's the one later on where he is, I think it's the one with Nakamura Yuichi, where he's like trying to kill the thing. Yeah, it's the new story. He doesn't get a body part, and he's just stabbing, like, fucking give me my fucking body. And and then it's like, oh my god, they've turned into the Skid, and this is great, because yes, it's frustrating for the viewer because we want to see it, and it's the engine that the show moves on. Obviously extra frustrating for Hyakkimaru, who's so close. Just give him his fucking arms and eyes. I do think the idea at the end of giving the arms and eyes to Tahomaru and his retinue is like one of the smartest things they do down the home stretch, because it makes for a really cool way to like show us that we are at a climax point. And yeah, it's very satisfying. Also, just a small moment, but the moment where they do, and this is in all versions of it, where he gets his spine back, is one of the best pieces of animation in this show. The way they show it popping out, and the like, it's the exact same thing in the manga, the makeshift spine that Jukai had made for him. But the idea of someone going from like basically like these like wooden cups in his back that are tied by a string to bone. Somebody in the production of this show had to think a lot about how to animate that and how to do the sound effects, and they did a great job.
Yeah, it's just there is a light body horror element to some of this version of Dororo, both in terms of how they do the violence, which is very like frank and very brutal. Like when Hyakkimaru gets his good leg ripped off by the antlion monster, which is what trades, right? Because it's like, I guess the fine print in the deal was, well, you can only get one part. And it's like, you had his voice, now you took his leg, you got to give the voice back, dude. It's like, we're demons, but we're not assholes. Like, come on. But it's like his leg gets ripped off, and you just see the fucking like shards of bone sticking at the bottom. Like, it's a very like brutal show, and how they do the bodily transformations has that as well with this body horror thing. And the fake spine just shooting out of his back, and that like kind of hollow sound that it makes as it shoots out. He grows his actual spine. It's both gross but also weirdly satisfying.
Yeah, and it's the dual process of the body being built back up and the humanity coming in and having to ask the questions of, what does it mean to have people to lean on, having to realize that his relationship with Dororo is a friendship, is a familial kind of bond. Like that's the thing about that Jukai episode that I love, and it's one of the best episodes of the show, is that both the ending of where he calls Jukai his mom, which is just beautiful, because that's the word he's learned for it from Dororo, and it's great, but also realizing what Dororo is to him, and that idea that, oh right, he wouldn't know what a friend is on that. He wouldn't be able to verbalize that because he's never been able to feel, any of this stuff. So it's those kinds of plot points that I think are so cool and so powerful. And absolutely, like, whatever mixed opinions I have on parts of this show, if you like Dororo at all, the main reason to watch this show is to see such a cool, unique take on Hyakkimaru that I think pays really good homage to what Tezuka came up with, but also takes it in a direction Tezuka didn't, which is the exact reason to do a new telling of Dororo.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's the thing that why I like having these two different adaptations of the original 1969 anime and this one. I think they just complement each other well, because it's like they just, this show is not trying to be the old show. It's not, and it's also not trying to be the manga. And I think that. And I just think that that's good, because there's no reason to try to be the manga, because you're not going to fucking top what the old one did, at least in the Tsukikizaru episodes. Like, you're not going to be able to out Banmo fucking Tezuka Osamu. Like, that's just not fucking going to happen. So it's like trying to say, no, let's pivot. Let's think of what is our own take? What is our own story? What is a thing we can do with these ideas? And saying like, well, like, there's a lot of space to do a very different thing with Hyakkimaru. I think it was just like a really smart choice, and the execution of it is just absolutely superb.
Yeah, so if I feel like they went a little too afield with Dororo or left too much behind, I think Hyakkimaru strikes the exact right balance in terms of how to do a remake. Here, I do want to go back on something you said, though, Sean, because you said, like, you're not topping the manga, you're not going to out, Tezuka Osamu. But they do, particularly in the first half, a lot of the stories from the original in ways that feel very half-hearted to me. Like, if we want to go through some of the episodes, like,
sure,
I think the story of Bandai, for instance, is such a vestigial version of it. I'm not sure why it's there. The Cursed Sword one is so vestigial. I'm not sure why it's there. I think the Dororo origin story gets softened in ways that just make it feel kind of pointless to me. There's a lot of that in the first half in particular, where I would have, because some of the original stories they come up with here and there, I actually think are pretty good. And I wonder if they could have come up with stories that better reflected what this show is doing than kind of just doing sanded down Tezuka here and there.
I don't know. So for me, I think this is something where, coming at it from the two different directions, I see it just very differently as somebody who started with this one, where, like, I think what this show is doing, right? So, like, here's like a big fundamental difference is that the old show did 2-parters, or if not 3-parters, with Banmo for all of those, which you kind of have to do if you're trying to do a very faithful version of the manga, because those are big chunk and manga chapters, right? These are big stories. It is very hard to do a like real adaptation of those stories in 25 minutes, let alone adapt them and then try to also insert a lot of your own original stuff. So what they do is they take the sort of germ of those stories and a lot of the iconic moments, but they kind of make different stories around them. And that's where it works for me. So like starting with Bandai, which I think if one thing they needed to do just to keep it with the times. This is a show. It's not 1969 anymore. It's 2019, guys. Come on. The character should be called Bandai Namco. It's like, you got to get over it. They've been merged forever at this point. But the story of Bandai Namco, right? They make this like very key central chair. They make a couple of key changes. One is they bring in Biwamaru / Natoichi here, to be your like, if Hyakkimaru cannot be your guide through hell, this is your guide through hell, is Zatoichi basically. Because I do have to shout out the actor who plays Biwamaru. Where is he? Sasaki Mutsumi, where he is not doing an impression of Shintaro Katsu from the Zatoichi movies, but he is doing kind of a bit of an invocation of that performance, and it's very well tuned. Like, I just get a lot of satisfaction out of hearing that character and the way he talks and the way he's written, where they're like, again, he's not Zatoichi, but he's pretty fucking close, and as a big Zatoichi fan, I enjoy that. But so they insert him into the story to kind of introduce that character, but they make this very fundamental change to the plot of that story, where in the original, the villagers were all ignorant of what was happening, right? They were just being manipulated and abused by Bandai, and they had no idea really what was happening here. Whereas in this story, they're all in on it. Like, they're the people who are trapping and murdering the random travelers, including they give more context for the Kanekozo yokai, where it is a traveling monk, who's killed, which is a huge, obviously, like, taboo to just kill this, like, traveling religious figure, and murder him for money, and then bury him in a bamboo thicket. And so the Bandai story now is about giving us a context for this larger theme about society being built upon the sacrifice of others, not just by the people in power, but by the people of that society who will resort to violence to protect the abundance that they have or protect their like livelihoods that's provided to them from like a bigger power structure. But it's all the people in that village are complicit in the violence that is happening. And I think that there's a lot of like changes like that suit the new themes of the show, and they have kind of pared down the episodes so that, like, yes, the individual stories are not as interesting as the equivalent stories from the manga or the original anime, but I also don't think they're trying to fulfill that same kind of function, because they are one smaller piece in the larger journey of Dororo and Hyakkimaru that this show is invested in telling this big journey from beginning to end. Whereas, the original stories are these kinds of very in-depth, really great big stories, but I think are sort of, and this is partially just because it never gets finished, but they're not aiming in like a clear direction. They're really good, but they're super episodic. They're not clearly building up to this like larger endpoint, which is what this show is trying to do.
So I agree with all of that in principle, and I guess one thing I want to stress is my complaint is not so much direct one-to-one, does it work as well as the 69 version, because they are separate shows trying separate things. But I do think, like, sometimes I watch this and I'm wondering if it's the best for this show. Like, with the Bandai Namco example, for instance, I agree that is what the episode is doing. I don't really feel it while watching it. Like, I agree intellectually that's what it's doing, but when it's doing it all in 22 minutes... and that one has to sort of set up our first story of going out, finding a village, finding a demon, killing it, getting a body part back. It has to introduce Biwamaru. It has to do these points. I think there's a lot of these episodes feel a little claustrophobic to me in how much has to kind of happen on a plot level and try to introduce like the theming around it. And I don't know if it breathes in a way where I feel like I'm watching it and discovering that theme as the episode progresses, so much as the characters will tell me what the theme is because there's so much kind of stuff going on by the end. Like, the village in the story of Bandai in the manga or the original anime is a village with people, and there's time, like, going around and kind of learning what their deal is. And there's very little of that in this show, where they get to a place and you're able to kind of see what the situation on the ground is. One of my favorite stories in this version of Dororo is actually on the other end of the show, the Amanojaku one, which is like very humorous, but it is one of the ones that spends the most time in a place, meeting its people, seeing different people in the village, what their deal is. And I think that's really necessary for the kinds of storytelling for it to come out what the theme of the story is. And a lot of these wind up moving through that really fast in a way that I don't feel by the end that I've like lived in the scenario and felt the theme come to the fore. I think the Banmon two-part in this really suffers from that, where I don't really get a sense of what life is like for all these people. And that one suffers just because it is adapting the most masterful thing in the original show. But like there's several of those like that. Or just ones where they break it down to the story's absolute roots and do like the skeleton of it, but in a way where I don't feel the meat on the bones. I think the Fair Fudo one is one of those, the blank-faced Buddha, which is probably one of the weaker stories in the original. But here we get this barest bones sped up version. We don't have any of the drama of watching Hyakkimaru try to investigate and figure out what's going on. We don't really see Dororo get fully seduced by the mother angle. We don't really see the lady demon grapple with her affection for Dororo. It just kind of plot point happens, and that one even has to make room for 5 extra minutes at the end of Tahomaru stuff. And so I don't feel the sense of like contingency or dramaturgy to it in the same way. And I feel those most often in the ones where it is adapting Tezuka and trying to serve, I think, a few too many masters within 22 minutes.
I guess I kind of see where you're coming from, but I don't think I felt that way. I think partially because, I mean, part of it is that like the Hyakkimaru of it all means that, like, particularly in that first half, like, yeah, you're not seeing how the people live or spending time there because Hyakkimaru can't do that. Like, he can't interact with these people. He can barely perceive them.
Dororo can.
Dodo can, but Dodo's not our, like, main character here, right? So it's like, it's the point of emphasis, right? It's like she's following Hyakkimaru on this, like, you know, incredibly single-minded pursuit of killing the demons. And she can, particularly in the first half, can barely keep up with Hyakkimaru because Hyakkimaru's not slowing down for her. And so I just think, like, for me, they give you these sort of, like, fairly simple one-off stories where you encounter this monster. They have some sort of fundamental tie into this larger theme of the notion of societies built on sacrifice, which is what nearly all of them are fundamentally about, some variation of that idea. But they're like vehicles for Dororo and Hyakkimaru to continue on their journey. And I think for that, it works well. Like it's how like we get into Hyakkimaru's growth and change. And as he becomes more human, the show slows down more and more. So in the first half, you've got two-part episodes in the first 12. And then the second 12, you've got one 2-parter, you've got one 3-parter, and you've got one 4-parter. So it's like most of the second half of the show are multi-part stories. And so for me, it's like a very intentional structure of the show is you've got a bunch of like, here's your like hit, we're getting story, establishing the routine, establishing how this works, going on these like adventures, and Hyakkimaru slowly building up his humanity with a couple of big pivot points, which happen at the end of each 6-episode section. So the big first one is the Mio one, then the next one is the Banmon one, right? And then you get the big 3-parter, which is the next big turning point. And as that happens, as he becomes more human, the show slows down. It becomes more introspective. So to me, like I kind of feel it as like it's the overall arc of how the show is growing and changing with Hyakkimaru. And I guess like the more abbreviated nature of a lot of the adaptations doesn't really bother me in that sense.
I agree with that broadly, but I also think like the individual stories are markedly better in the second half when they have time to be fleshed out. And I guess this is my criticism is there a way to more fulsomely find a different way to tell the story in the first half if you're taking Hyakkimaru as your point of view and saying we can't do this, that, and the other thing? Because I do think a lot of those stories, like particularly, I'm just like looking through your notes, I've already forgotten a lot of the first 12 episodes. Like I think there's a lot there that if that's the case, I wonder if you could have just like breezed through that faster, if there's things you didn't need. Like I don't really remember, like their take on the cursed sword goes by so fast. I don't remember its purpose. There's the Saru episode that I couldn't tell you anything. I don't remember that one at all. There was a monkey boy, I think. I don't remember remember. There's just things like that. And in the second half, they feel very vivid to me for the most part, in part because they slow down and actually build stories out of these things.
Yeah. Well, for me, my biggest criticism of the show is it's episodes 7 and 8, which are the two like true one-offs that are totally original stories. It's the story of the Jotoguma Silk Spider, which is the one that one's fine. Like it's very different.
I actually like that one. I like that. That feels like a fully articulated story to me because you have the woman who is the Silk Spider, and there's the arc of learning that not all the yokai are evil, and there's like, I feel like you get to know the society a little better because there's like the person trying to get the escape route, but you learn that he's actually in love with the demon and get all those things. Like that felt articulated to me in a way the other ones didn't.
But that's also the one, essentially, because that's the one where Dororo and Hyakkimaru are the most like vestigial. Like if they weren't in that episode would not be particularly different. And so it's like, I think it's like fine as an episode on its own, but I don't think it's effective at being the like a piece in the larger tapestry of the show. Because for me, this show is like, it's not about the individual episodes so much as it is about the overall arc. And so some of those earlier episodes are not like incredible on their own, but partially because it's such a bingeable show. It's a show that's so easy to just like move from episode to episode. I think because it is about that larger movement, it's not about the smaller movements of individual episodes in that way. So it's like, yeah, the Jotoguma one is probably one of the most fully articulated single episodes in terms of its own plot. It's also the one that, like, if you had to cut one of these episodes, that would be one of the episodes you would cut from the overall show, and you would see the least damage to the overall narrative theme and dynamics if you did that. The worst one is the story of Saru. That's the one about like the little boy who kind of looks like a monkey and his sister is going to get sacrificed to the big centipede thing in the sky. Like it's got some really cool animation. The fight is really cool in that one, but it's another one where it's just like it just sort of feels like it's another yokai episode when you're starting to get ready for the show to move out of that mode. And it's the last of those, basically. I guess other than like Hakumen Fudo is kind of one of those, but that's also kind of a fall-off episode from Banmon. Because most of the second half is not like that.
Yeah, and I guess my question is, why do any one-off episodes if the focus is more on the overall thrust of things, as you're saying? Then, I don't know, like, because the best of the first 6 is the two-parter with Mio and the Moriko-san one, and spending a lot of time there and getting to know a place. And, like, I guess I just don't quite see the point of some of the one-parters that don't do much for me. And this extends even to the Dororo origin story one that I think is like really rushed. It feels like, I know you have a problem the same as I do of the way they changed the death of Dororo's father, which I think is really bad. And just like, even like the death of his mom in that one, that is a long scene that breathes and you feel the tragedy and the horror and the hopelessness of their situation. And in this, it's they're walking and she drops dead and we move on. And there's a lack of like ability to just be in the moment that is in some of these early episodes that I don't respond to as well as when they do just embrace we're a serialized show and we're going to go for it.
Yeah, I do think like if I were to make a big change, I would say cut the story of Saru or Jotoguma Silk Spider, either one, and make the story of the Merciless, the Dodo backstory one, make that a two-parter. Like that's one of the ones that should have been a two-parter. Yes. To give it, because I agree, like that one needs the most space to breathe. Now, to your other criticism, I think for me, the reason why you want to have a bunch of these one-off episodes that give you like a single bite of plot, it is about establishing a routine, and it's about establishing like the status quo of the show so that status quo can be changed. Because this is a problem I've had with the original Dororo, is the structure of the original Dororo is very weird, where Dororo and Hyakkimaru do not spend much time together before you get to Banmon, because the first like that early section of the original Dororo is so overwhelmed with two big flashback stories, Hyakkimaru's big flashback and then Dororo's big flashback, and then outside of that you have the Bandai story and you have the Cursed Sword story, and then you're straight into the Banmon. And it's like they have been on two adventures and you're already at what feels like a narrative peak where Hyakkimaru kills his own younger brother. And that's part of where, like, I'm talking about with the Banmon, that, like, some of that stuff, like Tahomaru dying, is amazing for that story. But where that story is placed in a larger, like, narrative, it feels very strange. This is, like, maybe the only... And I didn't really mention this in the last episode talking about the 1969 one because I didn't want to get into this show, but it's the only thing I have an issue with the Sugi Gizaburo version of it, and it's just comes straight from the manga, is it does feel very weird how little time Hyakkimaru and Dororo have actually been together. By the time you get to like episode 12, they've had a couple of adventures. Whereas here, by the time you get to Banmon, and especially by the time you get to the second half, you feel like they have been on this big journey, that they have been all over Japan. They've killed all these demons. They have spent all this time and they have grown together. And in order to do that, I think the choice they've made as a production is to have, like, let's have these one-off episodes that establishes that routine, establishes that formula, so that way when you've mixed it up, it really feels like you have had a status quo that is now being transformed, which is a thing that I think the original series kind of struggles with doing.
And so I understand what you're saying. I totally get where you're coming from, but I kind of feel the opposite criticism. I kind of feel like a quality over quantity thing here, where yes, the only two major non-flashback stories before Banmon in the original are The Cursed Sword and This Tale of Bandai, but I think those are two really good stories, both done in two-parters that are, like, really fleshed out. And I do feel the sense of a journey, I think, because of that and because of the amount of, like, emotionality that has come out of all of this. Part of the problem with this show doing its kind of, I think, fairly thin one-parters is that they feel fairly samey. I don't get, because they've removed a lot of the political, historical, like, the war-torn aspects of it, I don't feel a huge sense of variation in the places they go. We don't get to know the guest stars much in the places we go. So I just don't feel like they've been around all that much. And Dororo is a much flatter character, so I don't know if I feel that same kind of connection by the time we get to the Banmon, like, the turning point. Like, I didn't feel much of a sense of a status quo turning point, whereas I think the 69 and manga versions do, just by dint of how good the form is, how vivid the characters are, those sorts of things, how long we spend in an individual story.
Yeah, I think it's like, I think it's just like sort of trading different qualities, because for me, this, like, what this show gets to across to me is that sense of development for Hyakkimaru that happens through the journey. And I think, like, part of that is, like, you need to have, like, the fights, you need to have the demons, you need to have him get his body parts back, and you have to, like, have that formula. And I enjoy that formula. Like, I don't think any of those, like, the one-off episodes from the first half are any of my favorite episodes, but I enjoyed all of them quite a bit. Like, I really like their version of the Bandai one. I really like their version of the Cursed Sword one. That one, I think, has a great ending where Hyakkimaru kills the guy and breaks the sword and gets his hearing back. And the first thing he hears is Osushi on the ground crying and the rain pouring on top of him. And a lot of that, because a lot of those early episodes are also themed around the thing that he gets back in that episode, that there's usually dialogue that sort of references and builds up to what that thing is going to be. I think that there's a lot of value in that, and I enjoy those stories as little kernel stories that are the pieces in, like, the journey and Hyakkimaru's specific development. Whereas in the old show, they feel like these stories exist entirely for their own sake. They are good on their own. You don't need to watch any of it to get, like, how good each story is. They are, like, so perfect in isolation, but they also don't ever build to a larger whole that goes, for me, past Banmon. Like, Banmon is the thing. So I think it's, like, partially just kind of like a taste of what we're, like, looking for from those kinds of episodes. And I perfectly like those episodes outside of, again, the Joroguma one and the Saru one. I could leave or take. But I think for me, the stronger ones are the ones that are taking the kernel of a story from the Tezuka stories and then doing something different with them.
That's fair. And I do think some of the ones later on, like, I think the Sabame two-parter, yes, which is a really memorable chapter in the manga that is not really fulsomely adapted in the anime. It's much more limited. I like, and this one is different in a lot of ways, but I do think it's, like, a really good telling of it, and it breathes at two parts. And even something like the Amano Jaku one, which is inspired by an episode from the anime, like, I also think articulates itself in a way that I found very satisfying by the end. So yeah.
I agree. And I just think, like, part of it is, it feels very natural to me that the second half of this show is a lot stronger than the first half, because that's the cumulative effect of what they're going for. They're just like that. That just feels like it's the kind of show that it is to me.
All right. Well, then, I mean, getting to the end of what you've termed Act 2, which is where we meet Tahomaru and have the Banmon stuff, I think this is where we have to address probably the most like significant narrative change to the original Tezuka stuff, which is its very different take on Daigo, why Daigo does the sacrifice, the role of Daigo's wife, and then the role of Daigo's son, Tahomaru. And this is where I also have some mixed feelings, because I think the idea of having Tahomaru live and do more with him as a character is a totally understandable one for reasons you've outlined. And I think the idea of giving a slightly different valence to Daigo, if you're not doing a story about like a war-torn nation the same way as they were doing, makes sense. But it also felt, for a while here, for me at least, a little bit thematically confused. I think it introduces some repetition with Tahomaru's role in the story that becomes a little frustrating to me in the second half. But I want to hear your take on it as it gets introduced here.
Oh, I really love that side of the story. I love the choice to flesh out like the nation of Daigo himself, Nui no Kata, who's the wife, and then Tahomaru, who's obviously like the big difference here, where they kind of turn Tahomaru into this kind of tertiary protagonist, or like he's really, and especially when you get into the second half, this show gets incredibly Shakespearean with the Tahomaru stuff. Like, he is such a like Edward from King Lear, right? He's like this dude who could have been the hero. He's the guy who could have been the protagonist. He's like Laertes in Hamlet, you know, that kind of mirror character for the protagonist. That's sort of an antagonist, but also you kind of can't fully articulate him as an antagonist. Like a really good production of Romeo and Juliet would have Tybalt in this role. Like, lesser productions of Romeo and Juliet just have Tybalt be a boring villain. The proper Tybalt is a Tahomaru kind of character. I just love this kind of character archetype where he is this kid who has been born with all the things that Hyakkimaru did not have, and yet there is just something missing. There's a lot of stuff here. One, I love that they have like fully explored what is a like mirroring of the characters in the original, but I don't think, because Tahomaru is not a like character that's around for all that much, that Tezuka doesn't get into it. But there is a good mirroring of the two characters just in their names and what their names mean. So Hyakkimaru means like boy of 100 demons, basically. Hyaku is 100, the ki is only demons, then Maru is just a standard boy name ending. Tahomaru means boy of many treasures. The ta means many, and ho is like hoseki, it's like treasure or jewel. And so I love that contrast, that it's like, this is the boy of many treasures. This is the boy with the silver spoon in his mouth. He's been given everything. And I love that he's a good guy. Like, he cares about his people. He cares about his country. He takes the role of a noble at its face value, and he takes it very seriously, right? And for that, he's incredibly naive, but like, I think he's a really likable character. So you have that episode, the story of Tahomaru, that is just a Tahomaru episode. They give him his posse that I call him here, Mutsu and Hyogo, and so he has his whole own world. And I love that you kind of set him up as like, this is a dude who could be so great, but because I think fundamentally of the choices that Daigo has made in sacrificing Hyakkimaru, I mean, one of the things that Tahomaru is missing is he didn't get to grow up with his big brother. There's a hole in his family that is there because of the sacrifice. And it's a hole that he can't fill on his own. And he's also like, that hole, I think, is also this like lie he's bought into about his role in the world, that he fails to see the ways in which Daigo is like destroying his world and destroying his land in the name of trying to save it. But I think just like all that stuff is very juicy character stuff that I think pairs so well with Hyakkimaru and the rivalry, which is obviously like the big standout thing in the second half. Yeah, and I'll stop there because that's I was going to move on to the mom, but that's kind of my Tahomaru stuff for now.
Yeah, I like Tahomaru. I like a lot of the exact things you're saying. I think particularly his role in the climax, the like final four episodes, is really strong. It is, as you say, very Shakespearean. It literally ends with a everyone except the protagonist dies, kind of scene. So you have all of that. I do think like the status quo it settles into of how many times you have Tahomaru go out, try to kill Hyakkimaru, fail, come back, feels a little Saturday morning cartoon villain to me in a way that I think I think there's a little too much. I particularly think it's kind of waters down the Shiranui story and that big three-parter at the Cape, where I want it to be a little bit more about Dororo, because that is literally the story where he is more active, or she at that point still, anyway, where Dororo, the gender-neutral Dororo is becoming a little more active in the story. And I think it gets a little distracted with another scene where we have to have a big confrontation where nothing fundamentally changes in the status quo between Tahomaru and Hyakkimaru because we're saving it for the big final fight. I do wonder if there's a little bit of a, again, quality over quantity thing here where you could have a big confrontation at Banmon and then have a lot of what happens in the climax without quite as many repetitions in the middle. In the same way, I also feel like the amount of time spent on is Hyakkimaru doing the right thing, killing demons, versus, you know, questioning Daigo's entire ideology that is kind of taken for granted by a lot of the characters, is a problem for me in the second half. And some of this is just watching it in such close proximity to the other versions of Dororo. Maybe I am too attached to Daigo as the biggest motherfucker to ever exist, because I was sold on his characterization here by the very end, because I do think, as I said before, the final scene where Hyakkimaru doesn't forgive him, but essentially says, I'm not going to pursue a path of violence with you, and puts down the statue that Jukai gave him, and all of that. Really beautiful, love that. But I think I was thrown for a little bit of a loop of how much, like, the Banmon story where a lot of this gets introduced is changed. And I do want, like, in the Banmon story, for instance, you still have the Sukeroku character there, but when it's a character who, like, is very vestigial, and then at the end, magically, his family is still alive and he gets to go off and Deus Ex Machina. Like, what is his role in the story? Like, there's bits and pieces that have survived from the Tezuka version of Banmon where I'm not sure what the purpose is. They've taken away the Cold War, but I don't know what they've put in its place for those things. And I feel that a little bit sometimes with the Daigo character and I wish the show maybe had a little bit more along the way to show that it's not just that he gave his people prosperity through sacrificing the kid. That act of cruelty is so cruel that it does ultimately degrade the society around him. And I think we get to that a little bit, like, spoken at the end of the show, but I wish there was a little bit more of an acknowledgement of that in the world we see outside of, like, Tahomaru himself.
But I think that's also part of the point of all the individual stories, is, like, all those stories happen because Daigo has made a deal with the demons and they are out in the world.
Yeah.
So all of the horrors that we see in all those episodes are all a result of Daigo and his selfishness and his belief that, like, it doesn't matter what else gets sacrificed as long as this core is strong, right? Like, that's so much what it is. And so all the people who are killed, all the sacrifices, all the little villages being controlled by demons, they're all being controlled by demons because of what Daigo has done and his sort of very short-sighted vision of the world and what quote-unquote prosperity means. So I guess I don't have that problem with Daigo because I think you do see the consequences of, like, that everybody who lives on the fringes in society, everyone who's marginalized in the society is exploited and killed. And you know, the buck kind of stops with Daigo for that. And that also, there's, you know, they don't go super in depth with this stuff, but there's, like, lots of little pieces of dialogue where you get the sense that's like, this is fucking up all the other surrounding nations as well. Because one of the changes in Banmon is that the fox demons are specifically just attacking the enemy. Like, they are basically there to protect the, like, Daigo border. And it's not the same, like, thing of, like, they're just the demons rising up from, like, the dead here and playing in jokes on the living, which is what the original is. It's like, here it's like part of the reason why the war with the Asakura happens in the first place in this version is because they know that the Daigo land is one protected and ruled by fucking evil. And so, like, we gotta go fuck these dudes shit up. They don't go super in depth with that, but it is part of, like, well, there's, like, lots of little lines in the background of the Banmon one that sets up that idea.
No, so that's a good perspective, and I'm glad to hear. I'm swayed by some of that. Yeah, I guess there's an intangibility that I have trouble expressing, in that I definitely felt, watching the show closely and thinking about it, like, because they introduced the idea in the Banmon two-parter that Hyakkimaru's sacrifice was necessary to create this abundance, and obviously that creates a one-to-one, like, very clear allegorical parallel to our world, where we have underclasses who do, like, people who have middle class on up, benefit from there being an underclass who make labor cheap and make accessing, you know, housing and food and all these things cheaper for the people at the top, but somebody has to suffer beneath. And there's all sorts of ways you can read that in terms of underclasses, in the way we do it in a capitalist society, literal caste systems that are codified in a society like India, ideas of disability, which obviously come through with Hyakkimaru because he is quite literally disabled in his various body parts missing and all of that. And I feel that I guess this intangibility I'm having trouble voicing is how long it takes for somebody in the show to voice the counterexample. Because even when Dororo is thinking about it, it takes Dororo a while to think about the opposite side of that. But is it okay to build that off the back of Hyakkimaru? And is it okay to have arranged a society around an exchange that is that fundamentally cruel? And again, we get there through a fairly didactic sequence in the penultimate episode with the mom explaining the themes of the show to us. But I guess I just don't know if I feel it in the world and in the stories that we go through along the way enough, because I felt a lot of me being outraged on Hyakkimaru's behalf and him not fully able to articulate beyond, and I find it very moving, although they took this from me, it's mine, I need to get it back. And maybe this is just me having a honest reaction to the show, wanting to make you uncomfortable with that idea in the first place and wanting you to sympathize with Hyakkimaru, even as everybody in this society has essentially been brainwashed by the status quo to believe that's okay. And maybe I'm talking myself into right now thinking the show's perspective on that is very valuable in making you feel the insanity Hyakkimaru feels in being gaslit into thinking this is okay. And that, if you need to cut up some motherfuckers because that's yours.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about right now is what I feel from the show, is that yes, I think there is supposed to be a frustration in the viewer where, because you have developed such sympathy and empathy for Hyakkimaru, and the only other person in the fucking world that has that at all is Dororo. And maybe Natsuichi / Biwamaru to a certain extent, or some individual characters in one-off episodes like Mio. But in general, Hyakkimaru is alone in the world with Dororo, right? Even Jukai can't even really get it all the way when he meets up with Jukai again until the end of that episode. And so I think you as the viewer are meant to establish this powerful empathy with Hyakkimaru, and then when everybody else in the world is like, yeah, but if we just killed you, our shit would be fine. And you're just like, fuck that. No, you don't get it. None of these people get it. How could you possibly think it's okay to live in this kind of society? And then I think think part of the reason why it really pushes that point really far is because we, the viewers at home, are living in that society and not doing anything about it, right? Our world is full of Hyakkimarus, and we're happily letting them die, and we're not even thinking about it. We're not even contemplating it. We're I'm watching it on a TV made by people who are Hyakkimarus, on a Blu-ray player made by people who are Hyakkimarus, on a disc that is manufactured by people who are Hyakkimarus, sitting on a couch that has materials made by Hyakkimarus. And that's what I'm doing, right? And so I do think that there is an essential, at how much the audience is sort of complicit in the horrors of that they are expressing through the theme. I think there is a reason to push it so far. I also think the other thing the show is doing is it is doing a so what on top of that, because it's doing a yes, what has happened to Hyakkimaru is horrible, but what do you do about it? Because I think that is the legitimate question of that Dororo is confronted with. This is Dororo's issue. Dororo knows that this is wrong and that Hyakkimaru has a right to his body and what has been taken from him, and that really that right is inalienable. You cannot deny him that. At the same time, Dororo also sees the consequences of Hyakkimaru violently taking all of his body parts back. This is most potent in the Sabame story, where that entire village and all the people living there that whole village is burned down and all those people die. Now, those people were probably going to eventually die because they were living under, the auspices of a giant evil moth creature that had killed the nun and the orphans for food earlier, right, and burned it down to hide it, and they were all complicit in that horrible crime. But regardless if that prosperity they were experiencing was eventually going to end in violence, likely either way, it's undeniable that those people died horribly at that time because Hyakkimaru pushed this and pushed it because he wanted something that was his. And so Dororo struggles with, what do we do about this? Is it right to try to take the prosperity that all of these people, many of whom, are complicitly living in sin, but are not actively doing anything against Hyakkimaru. They're not like going out and doing anything against him directly. They're just living under the bounty of the cost of his sacrifice, and obviously the cost of sacrifice of all the other marginalized people like Mio and the orphans and the other characters we meet along the way that exist in the same strata that Hyakkimaru does. And I do like that the show's ultimate conclusion is Dororo going, no, fuck it. Like, yeah, kill him. Like, you can get your hands bloody. It is okay. That doesn't make you a demon. You can use violence when violence is called for. And that will have consequences on you as an individual person, and like your morality and your soul and your conscience and all those things. Like, you know, it's not just like great to go around murdering motherfuckers, but also, like she directly says in the penultimate episode, like sometimes you have to get blood on your hands the way that Mioniki has in order to get back the things that are rightfully yours. And that does not put you on the path of the Shura or the demon, which is what Biomaru says. And so I think that theme and that idea, I really love the way the show expresses it. I love the frustration it puts in the viewer. I love the empathy it gives you for Hyakkimaru and the way that like it makes you kind of question your own complicity in these kinds of ideas. And I think the conclusion it comes to feels very real to me, because I think just going full on like, and we just got to murder them all and it's fine. Like, that's obviously like, no, like I don't believe that we should just go kill all the people who are complicit in this shit. But also you can't just let it go. And that's like a very complicated path to walk. And I think I like how the show lands on all those ideas.
So let me come at it from another way then, which is, I guess I want to, the one thing, I agree with everything you're saying. The one thing I want to question is the show's relationship to Hyakkimaru's violence, because it has a consciously schizophrenic relationship with it. It has a consciously, this is necessary because it's the only way to get his body back, but it is also uncomfortable. Like, that is not that is the show's, like, it is voiced by Dororo. It's exactly what you're saying, right? And there's the conversation in the penultimate episode about the path of the Buddha versus the path of the demon, and we cannot be either one, and maybe that's the place where the show lands. But it is also, like, literally the only way in the fiction for him to get his body back is through this violence. There is no other, he can't go and reason with the demons as far as we know or anything, right? He can't go trade someone else's body, or though that would also be an act of violence, right? Yeah. So that is the way he has to do it. But it is also something that once done, he has to, like, disavow and walk a path of peace, and that is what he chooses. Now, part of that is because he has now regained his body, he is able to choose how he will live in it, and that is the message of his final scene with Daigo. But I wonder, like, I don't know if I'm fully satisfied, and maybe you're not supposed to be satisfied, and that is a perfectly reasonable answer to this, with the, is it the path of Buddha or is it the path of the demon? He's not becoming a demon, but we also can't become a perfect Buddha and not be active in the world and violent when violence is called for. And maybe that is a reasonable, like, gray area to land on in this story. But I also feel like by the end, like, some tension there. And again, maybe that tension is necessary. But the only body part he gets back through not killing, and it's kind of on a technicality, is Tahomaru, who still does die.
Yes. But Tahomaru, you know, the culmination of Tahomaru's arc is to willingly give up the thing that is not rightfully his and give it to his brother. And only that can he obviously fill the hole in his heart, both literally and metaphorically, literally in terms of how Hyakkimaru can see the world.
Well, do you think Tahomaru should die there? That's one question. Like, do you think, because what he dies of is very, like, it's demon nonsense. Like, there's not a clear, he doesn't, like, get stabbed and die because Hyakkimaru does, like, pointedly refuses to kill him, and then Tahomaru, and I think this is all correct in that Shakespearean sense of Tahomaru reaches the ultimate point where he could have the thing, he is a better fighter, he could take it through violence, and at the last moment, the last decision he makes is not to do it, even if it means not having his eyes, and then you have Tahomaru decide, this thing, all the things I have been given are not mine, this is not mine, I will give it back. Is there a version of this where he should live past that point then? Like, I'm poking at it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, yeah, I do think that, like, obviously the themes that this show is getting at are, like, really complicated because it's like, you know, there's no way to fix society, right? There's no way to, like, solve these problems just, like, by snapping your fingers. I think it is, like, a very real question of, like, how far is it okay for you to go to push the boundaries in order to try to fix the evils in the world is obviously, like, a thing that we all struggle with every day. Yeah. On the Tahomaru thing, like, I think I could see a version of him living and a version with him dying. I think there's just something kind of cleaner about the ending that they have gone with. It's just, like, easier to deliver, of, like, it's got that extra catharsis. It's got the tragic Shakespearean element, right, of, like, Tahomaru has gone too far. Like, he kind of has to die, that his ambition has pushed him to such an extreme. He's gotten Mutsu and Hyogo killed. He has willingly turned himself into a demon in order to do this. And giving that up means kind of giving up his life as well. Like, I think that there is something that sort of dramatically makes sense with that. And obviously it's combined with this sort of interesting moment that it almost like it moves into this other space to me in that last episode, this other kind of narrative or dramatic realm, when you have the mom there and Jukai. You've got the two moms in Hyakkimaru's life coming together. Jukai gives Hyakkimaru the Kanon statue, the Bodhisattva, one of the sort of gods of Buddha and of Hinduism, or Buddhism. And now it looks exactly like Hyakkimaru's actual mother, who's now wearing the shawl in that exact way. And then they both go over to sort of cradle Tahomaru before they all burn off screen. Like, there's just something about that it enters like a kind of poetic realm to me. Because this is also when Hyakkimaru first gets his eyesight, and it's like the first scene he looks at. I don't know, there's an almost like dreamlike quality to that, where the ending of the show moves into a different space, which I think also kind of sets up some of what it does with, like, the very, very ending, where you're presented this sort of weird dreamlike vision of a future where they are maybe reunited again. That Tahomaru's death to me gets wrapped up in that kind of realm, if that makes sense.
No, and I totally agree with all that, and I think it is, like, visually, aesthetically very satisfying. I'm always slightly wary of story points where there is a will you or won't you kill the person, and you choose won't you, because that's the correct thing for the character to do, but then the character dies anyway, like, because the plot has been manipulated in such a way that that's going to happen anyway. As you say, maybe it's the easier, neater version of the story. It is easier and neater, but I'm always just slightly wary of the thing happened either way. It, like Hyakkimaru did not affect the outcome of the scene of whether Tahomaru would die. Like, that's, and I think when you're having heady questions about violence and enacting it, that's something that, and again, this is not just a complaint I have with Dororo, it's a common theme in stories where you have this kind of ultimate decision, but then whether the protagonist makes the decision or not, the person dies anyway. That always, it's not that I necessarily dislike it or find it dishonest. I just always am kind of curious, what does the alternative look like? Because it does feel easy and neat in a way that is narrativized and not fully thematized to me.
Yeah. And I totally get what you're saying. I do think, obviously, like, part of the point is, like, yes, Hyakkimaru does not have an ability, practically speaking, in that scene, based on how things end up, to determine whether or not Tahomaru lives or dies, but he does get to help decide what kind of person Tahomaru dies as. And obviously that's kind of like where it is. That's part of the, like, I do think that the moment when Tahomaru shows up with Hyakkimaru's eyes, with Mutsu and Hyogo, those characters are dead. Like, they have to die. There's just something, like, they have crossed such a line. Like, that is so horrific that it's not just an abstract thing that we're living off of your sacrifice. We've literally cannibalized your body and grafted it onto our own and taken what is yours for ourselves in order to try to kill you. And that's, like, such a, like, evil fucking thing that it just kind of feels like you can't come back from that. The best you can do is kind of redeem yourself in the end, but I don't know if you can live anymore after you've done that.
But I'm curious about the question, and I guess, one other thing I'll say here, just taking a step back. These are not, is this thing a good or bad show discussions. Yeah. This show has reached a necessary threshold of intelligence and quality that we can have these deeper conversations. So I always like to stress this point when because part of this is me just testing the ideas, because I'm curious about my own. I finished watching this show 2 nights ago, and you've watched it, you saw it 5 years ago, and this is your second time through it. So we just come at it from different angles. And I think if we want to have a rich discussion about it, part of it is just pushing at the edges of, how does it say the thing, right?
Yeah. And I think all this, like, with this conversation, shows for me is how good the cumulative impact of the show is, which is, to me, like, kind of what I've been saying with, like, the design of the show, is it's about that cumulative impact. Like, I think that the last 4 episodes are so fucking killer, because the last 4 are basically like one big 4-parter bringing you to the end. The stories of breaking the cycle of suffering, Nui, demons, and then the last episode, which is just called Dororo and Hyakkimaru. No more story appendment on that. I just think that 4-parter is so good at delivering all this action, because that's where it starts with Tahomaru and his posse coming in to try to attack Hyakkimaru. This is the 3rd time they've done it. Here I want to, like, with your, like, one Tahomaru criticism of, like, he does this too many times. I don't know if I really feel that, because it's technically 4 times, but for me, it's really 3, because I think this fight and then the later fight in the 4-parter are just extension of one big thing. So they only really fight, generally speaking, 3 times in the series. It's just the last one is a big fight that has, like, 3 phases to it. Because I do think in the Shiranui story, it is important that Tahomaru tries again and he fails again, because that's the thing that pushes him so far, that he feels he is such a failure that he cannot do this. He cannot kill his brother for the glory of Daigo and to bring prosperity to his land, that he needs that extra level of frustration to get to the point where he's eventually going to fucking take parts of Hyakkimaru's body into himself. Like, I think it's like a thing that character really needs to experience. I think works for me. But when you get in, yeah, go ahead.
Well, can I just say 2 specific things I love about this final 4-parter? Is, one, I love the role of the mother. I think the
Yes.
role of Nui and the idea that, I do think in the penultimate episodes it gets a little too didactic for me in the writing, but I like that there's a kind of Socratic back and forth with her and Dororo on this little journey they go on, of her having, basically you watch someone who it is a almost like de-radicalization for her, where she has to be able to live consciously and not go insane in the world she lives in. She has rationalized that it was okay that they did the thing to Hyakkimaru. And it is through, it's not even that Dororo really, like, makes a firm argument, because Dororo is a kid who can't really verbalize that way, but it is through being with someone who has been with Hyakkimaru and seen him fully as a human being that she realizes how much that was a rationalization and how wrong it was. And I think that part of it is, like, I think if you're talking about cumulative effects, I think that's one of the smartest things it does, because that's where the show starts to pull back on the, if you were feeling gaslit a little by the last 10 episodes and how everyone was talking about Hyakkimaru, it's okay. You were not the wrong one. The wrong one was someone like the mom who was rationalizing to herself that this was okay. And I think that is really well done, and I like that. The second thing I really love... do you want to comment on that before I move on?
I just totally agree. I really like the mom's role. It's one of the big expanded roles, right? It's the thing where, with the Banmon story, which I think inevitably the Banmon story in this is nowhere near as good as the original, whether you're talking about the manga or the 1969 one. I think there's just no question about that. Like, it's not even close. And maybe it could have been better. I
honestly wonder if you, like... Did it need the big wall? Like, maybe there's a version of that that's just about them encountering Daigo's territory, and it probably would have been creatively cleaner for the show just to not do the Banmon thing, not to do Sukaroku, just to, like, make it its own story. I think probably would have been smarter.
Yeah. Because it's more different than most of the other adaptations. It's more different than the Bandai one. It's more different than the Cursed Sword. It's more different than the Hakumen Fudo. All those are much more similar to their counterparts. The Banmon one, the only similarity basically is that Sukeroku's there. There's a shadow of Sukeroku's plot, and then there is the Banmon. But even what the Banmon is different. It's not a wall. It's like an old fort or town here that was the border town that was destroyed, and this is the last part of that town. And so it's not the Berlin Wall thing. But what the Banmon story does is it's about setting up this whole arc with Nui, who is this woman who's like emotionally catatonic after losing Hyakkimaru, and is obviously closed off to Tahomaru, which is part of that other hole in his chest, right? It's like one of the only treasures he can't have is his mother, because she is always praying to the Kanon statue that sacrificed itself so that Hyakkimaru could live. But like the Banmon story is really about that sort of trio of Tahomaru, the mother, and Hyakkimaru. And so the climax of that story is the mother's Nui coming up with the Kanon statue and her saying, I cannot save you, right? Like, she has reached this breaking point where she does the thing you said, where she rationalizes that she has no choice. She later she articulates it as she has this dual role of the wife of the Lord and as a mother. And in that moment, she chooses the wife of the Lord, saying that's like, I'm going to accept that you have to die for the prosperity of our land. Then she obviously tries to kill herself. She doesn't succeed. But then the losing that sort of like guiding light of the mother is what then causes the Kanon statue to be destroyed and thus release the last demon. And so that's like that dark turning point in the middle is Hyakkimaru realizing he has a family. But here he is not kind of rejected by his brother Tahomaru, which is what happens in the original. Here he's rejected by the mother, which is in some ways more brutal, just in the sense of like, it's this one thing that has always been like pure good in the world of Dororo, is that the mother's love for Hyakkimaru is kind of unfailing in the original. And then here it fails in this moment, which has dire consequences for everything that happens. That presumably if the mother had not failed in that moment, Kanon's protection would not have been denied. And then, the second half of the show maybe would have been a lot different if she had been stronger in that moment. And so then when she gets this opportunity to make up for it, I love that one, they do the like feint where she's going to like let Dororo go, but then go back and choose to be the wife of the Lord. And then she's just like, no. And she just runs off to be with Dororo. There's something about that moment I love. It's just like, no, fuck that. Just fuck that shit. I'm a mom. I'm going to be mom. And that's so much more important than all this other bullshit. And I love that little moment and how they characterize her and the kind of clarity the character gains by like embracing this clear role in the world and what actually matters to her, and not the like justifications that she has been swallowing from Daigo the entire time. And so that whole arc that is sketched out across the show with Nui no Kata, I think is just really, really beautiful.
I agree. The other thing in this final four-parter that I just adore, and I think is far and away the best adaptation of any story in the manga to the anime version of Dororo, is what they do with Midoro and the demon horse. Like, it is, because when they introduce Midoro and the Foal in one of these episodes, and you see them, and they're drawn like they're like the only Tezuka-esque characters in this whole show, because no one else really looks like a Tezuka character design except the horse. And I'm like, I did have a little bit of like, are you guys really going to try to one-up, Tomino on this one? Because that's akin to the Banmon episode. If you're not going to outdo the Midoro story from either the manga or especially the anime, where it goes especially gonzo with it. And so they really don't. Like, this is much more akin to what I wish some of the other stories did, I think, actually, in certain places, of just take the bare element and then go bonkers in a different direction with it, where the basics of the story are there. Midoro is separated from her foal, and she is sent into war and becomes a demon because of it. But they do it completely differently, where Midoro is sent into war with Hyakkimaru, is thrown off the cliff and explodes, because they basically make Midoro into a kamikaze machine, and then Midoro explodes with Hyakkimaru, and then comes back as the fiery demon horse that Hyakkimaru is riding to destroy Daigo's land. That is the most heavy metal shit.
Yeah.
It's so great. It's like so righteously furious, but then it is also so thematically clean with the rest of the story of it is about a boy coming back and a mother coming back, and it is about a mother coming to the boy and a boy coming to the mother on the two sides of the story. Perfect. So good. Yeah. Loved all that.
Absolutely. It's the best remix of original material. Absolutely.
Yes.
It's so, especially because it's the thing where a lot of the other stuff is stuff that, like, if you're, especially with us having like recently rewatched it with the original, you kind of have to try to look past the original, right? Because that's the thing that I, while I, have this love for this version of the story from when I originally watched it, like, I did have an adjustment period with some of those early episodes of being like, right, I got to put the 1969 one out of my head, because if I don't, some of that stuff will just be very distracting. But this is where your love for the original amplifies what's going on, because it's just because the Midoro one, it's such an iconic story. It's one of the stories that is in basically every version of Dororo. It's in the game. It's in like the manga versions. I don't know if it's in the movie, but probably not. But who knows? You wouldn't even know, because
I didn't finish it.
They just finish it.
It wasn't in the half I saw.
Yeah, but like, it's in the other versions of Dororo I've seen, like the game. It is often the Midoro stuff is remixed, but it's just a very iconic story. It's one of the stories that just keeps on getting picked up. And having it here where, as you say, it's the most heavy metal shit, like someone should draw this on a van, the fucking boy with swords for arms, riding on the giant fucking flame horse, laying waste to a samurai army, like, that's fucking cool. And like the giant fire tornadoes and all that. And the other side of it is like, there's that, some of that Shakespearean quality of the climax here, where you've got the whole like Dororo has been captured, and as far as Hyakkimaru knows, she is still captured, and Hyakkimaru is trying to save her. But we, the audience, know that Nui no Kata has already let her out, and they're out looking for Hyakkimaru. And so that has this great sort of tragic quality of where Hyakkimaru is going over a line where he is not just like killing some people, he's killing a lot of people at this point. This is the kind of thing where at the end of the story, he probably needs to go on a soul searching journey because he did kill like dozens and dozens of people in this like blood fueled rampage here. And also, and part of the tragic thing is that blood-fueled rampage was not really necessary. Like, if Hyakkimaru was more cautious, if he was more level-headed about what he was doing, he all that could have really been avoided. And that's part of the thing that makes this all so powerful, because Tahomaru is, of course, experiencing the same thing. Tahomaru is rash. He's going too far. He puts Mutsu and Hyogo at risk. They get their fucking arms cut off, which is brutal. And that is like that's where like them having these characters. So I really like Mutsu and Hyogo. They've built them up well as these likable characters that you don't want to see them get hurt, even if Hyakkimaru is in the right. Like I don't want to see them get killed. Like they're good people. They're on the wrong side of history, but they're not bad. And so them getting their arms cut off and then turning into demon monsters is pretty brutal. But then the most heavy metal thing is that that's how they get killed, because fucking they stab Ghost Phantom Midoro, and you think that, oh no, Midoro's dead, and the Midoro gets a second win and fucking bites and rips Hyogo's fucking head off, and then kicks Mutsu in half. It's like, fucking Jesus Christ. Good. It's so brutal.
So, and here's like, this actually helps me like maybe verbalize a critique with other parts of the show, is that I think... While I think the ideas of a lot of the show are right on, if you think about like what is said by characters, what is in the script, what is in the plot summary, sometimes I think as beautiful as the show is, its formal qualities don't fully encompass the themes to me. I think that is something I feel in some of the early episodes and in other points. It's the kind of thing that I do wonder if is just harder to do when you're doing this kind of anime production with 100 different studios and subcontractors. And like, I don't think this is a funny sentence. I don't know if the KyoAni version of Dororo would feel quite as disparate in that way to me, where I think it would be built in. You would get like, your death cloud symbols or something like that. But I do think this moment is pointing to what I feel is missing some other times. I think the image of Hyakkimaru coming into Daigo's land on a flaming fucking horse and killing everything in sight, because this is the thing that this society has repressed and they have fought against and they have violated, and now it has come back and the chickens are coming home to roost, and it is this thing that you cannot read literally. It is so purely symbolic and poetic. It is so purely like that grand Shakespearean gesture that you're talking about, Sean. That's it. And maybe there are some other points in the story where I wish I felt it visually, formally that strongly, but ultimately we have it at the climax here, and that's the point where it is most important to have, and it's there and it's great.
Yeah, because again, this is where like the show has reached obviously a breaking point, because the other half of that image is he's also fighting his brother and his brother's posse, who have now literally taken on his body parts.
Yes.
So that part of it also has just like gone fucking crazy, right? It's no longer metaphorically there's some contract of a demon or whatever that's bringing prosperity to this land. It's like, no, literally they are using the recycled parts of your body to try to suppress you. It's all great. It's fucking crazy. That's
take the metaphor and make it epic poetry. Like, that's what it is. It's make it, heavy metal art on the side of a van. That's what they've done here, and it's great.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So then you get we talked about the stuff where we have the sort of the symposium or whatever of Natoichi, Nui no Kata, and Dororo, and then there's like the country bumpkins that are there too, who are convenient because that whole conversation starts because one of them just gets to sort of like pose the fundamental premise of the show, where he's like, wait, so you're telling me that like all of like that bounty we experienced for those 10 years or whatever was all because of this deal with the devil with Hyakkimaru's body? Like, I mean, what if we just sacrifice his body again? And like, wouldn't we get all that shit back? Which is the sort of inciting point for Dodo to flip the fuck out on that dude and jump up on him and just smack him around. But that's also the thing that spurs this conversation. And it's like, and I kind of agree with you that maybe it's a bit much of how much they exposit here, though I do think there's also value to like these characters would legitimately be like, you know, conversing these things. Like, I think there is a validity to having the characters who are at a crossroads, like verbalize what they are experiencing and trying to reason things out together. And I do like what they say, like that Nui no Kata, you know, she talks about how fragile a world built on this kind of sacrifice is, and how it implicates the people living in there. Biwamaru is the one who presents the dichotomy of where he says that there are the two paths, the path of the Shura, or the Asura, the demon, right, the vengeance demon, and the path of the Buddha. But either path, you are no longer human, right, on those two extremes. But the thing that I like is that Dororo rejects that dichotomy, and that's what I really like about this conversation, that, yes, Biwamaru offers that up, and that sounds like a very beautiful notion that makes sense, that, like, it instinctually makes sense that there's these two extremes. Like, if you hit any of those extremes, you no longer are a human, and that obviously has a lot of, like, religious Buddhist implications, because it's a lot of the shit in the show does. But Dororo just rejects that and says, like, no, like, that's too easy of an answer. And that's where she gives the whole speech about how, like, it is okay for us to bloody our hands to get back to things that are rightfully ours. And that does not doom you to be a demon. Like, nor do you have to, like, you know, just take everything on and be this merciful Buddha figure. And that you can still be a person. And it's like that dichotomy is maybe like a logical trap that keeps people passive in the status quo. She doesn't go so far as to express it that way, but that's kind of how I feel like why that dichotomy should be rejected, is it's too easy of an answer, and it's the thing that, like, people use to over intellectualize this kind of thing in order to make it comfortable that they don't engage with it and don't actually do anything. And that the whole point that Dororo has is, like, we have to do something about it. You have to start somewhere. And if all you do is stand around here and philosophize about these big moral issues, you're never going to start. So it's like, let's take our first steps. And that's when she leads them to go march up to the castle. And I love that dynamic. It's like, it maybe goes too long. They could have, like, made it a bit more succinct, but I do love a lot of what the show is saying in that big kind of debate between those three characters.
Yeah, and my complaint is not that the scene exists. It's a matter of degrees, and I think you're saying the same thing. But yeah, the final four, it's the strongest part of the show. It closes. I feel like aesthetically, it is also just, honestly, the entire kind of final six here, which are all MAPPA production episodes, right? Because at that point, there's none of the Tezuka. Not that the Tezuka production ones are, like, notably lesser or anything, but I do think there's, like, an artistic purpose of unity. Even the Amano Jaku one, which is kind of the final standalone one, is all in fall colors. That is, like, the most stunning thing I've looked at on my OLED TV so far, is the fall foliage reds that they use in the, like, very clearly hand-painted backgrounds of this show, which use a lot of watercolors as well and things like that, and are just fucking gorgeous. All six of these final episodes are tremendous in terms of the production value, and yeah, it's why I watched them all in one sitting. It's just that good. And it was even, I had been pretty tired that day. I'd done a lot of different things, and I think I got to, like, the third of those last six episodes, so the beginning of the final four-parter, and I was feeling like I was about to, like, fall asleep and, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do the rest of these tonight. And I had extra time. I had a whole lot of extra day I could have finished this show. But I just got a second wind once I think they probably were started introducing the Midoro stuff. And I was just like, I'm going to, and it carried me through. So, yeah. One thing I want to ask, we haven't talked about the Biwamaru character that much. Or we've talked about him around the edges, Natoichi, who's voiced by Sasaki Mutsumi here, who is obviously a much more present character in this version of the story because he just keeps showing up everywhere. I don't know if you remember at all, like, the first time you saw this show, did you have any inkling of, like, are they going to reveal that there's something magical about this dude? Because he's always in the right place at the right time. He's almost feels like a little bit of a trickster figure kind of dancing around the edges of the show. This is not a criticism, by the way. This is something I like about him. But I did wonder, like, particularly down the home stretch, he gets so... He's always there. I was even wondering, like, is the ending of this that's actually Hyakkimaru from the future coming back to, like, affect events, and this is why he's such a skilled samurai? And I was even thinking, like, maybe he never gets the eyes because they're with Tahomaru, and that's the... I was over-theorizing it, and ultimately it's just he is a very kind of, Greek chorus kind of figure for the show, and that's totally fine. But he's used very uniquely in this series.
Yeah. Like, I wish I knew a lot more about, like, Japanese Buddhism, because I wonder if some of that comes from there, because obviously there's a lot of very Buddhist themes. You know, you've got the Kanon statue, and that goddess like is very present in the show, and the idea of the mother figure. And it's like and obviously like the demons and stuff, the notion of the path of the Shura or the Asura, which is also a Buddhist idea, right? That's like very present. And because there is something about him that like in a Western context, he feels like Zeus or Odin, you know, like this kind of divine figure in the guise of an unassuming old man. Like that's just such a common trope. That I wonder if there is a Buddhist or like fiction or like folkloric kind of equivalent to something like that. Because yes, I think I don't think he's literally meant to be magical, but he has that element to him and that quality to him in the story. And I do like it a lot. And I just love the performance. I love how Zatoichi-ish he is. There's one moment in the Mio episodes where he's going and scouting out a path, and he finds this little side path that's like a game trail made by the animals, and he just bends over and says it's like, yes, it's often you little critters that find the real ways to navigate this world, or something like that. Like is like how you translate it. He says in Japanese, he uses the word omai-san to talk to the animals, and it's the most fucking Zatoichi line ever, the way he says it. And I'm like, I love it. I love this character archetype. I love Zatoichi. I love the performance. Obviously the character design does not look at like Zatoichi at all, because they're you know, it's the same Tezuka, like he's like a weird crazy old man, but the affectation of the character is totally on point, and I like it a lot. One thing with him, I think one of my favorite moments with him is in the story of the Nue episode, which is the thing that brings us into the big climactic four-parter, because that's the one where the monster, the Nue, knocks Dororo and Hyakkimaru off the cliff, and Dororo gets stuck and is stuck under all the rocks and is going to get drowned. And Hyakkimaru is like banging against the rock, trying to move it. He can't. He breaks his own arm in a like Ghost in the Shell like moment from the end of that movie, where, you know, his mechanical body can't withstand what he's trying to do, and he's just like futilely stabbing and scraping his sword arms against the rock, can't do anything. And then this is when Biwamaru has his most out of nowhere divine intervention style rescue, where he comes in, he pulls Hyakkimaru aside, takes his sword cane and just sticks it in the rock, uses it as a lever. The sword breaks, but it saves Dororo's life. And it's such a great visual illustration of Hyakkimaru's limitations as a character at this point, that like he is not as limited by the things he lacks as he thinks he is, right? That like he thinks and he internalizes that Dororo almost died because he doesn't have his human arms. And if he had just had his human arms, he could have saved Dororo. And so that's, I think, the big motivation for why he goes like kind of psycho when he kills the Nue. And then when it doesn't give him his body parts back, because he thinks he's going to get an arm back. And it doesn't. And that's when he decides, I'm just going to go to Daigo. I'm going to press the issue, and I'm just going to fuck those people up and get my body back. Even though that's an incredibly reckless thing to do. And it's like, obviously Biwamaru, being a much older, wiser figure, knows that these swords don't have to just be weapons used to slaughter people and monsters. They're tools, and they can be used in any way you could think of a tool to use, in the same way that your arms are. And so he can just, you know, he uses it as a tool to save Dororo's life rather than using it only as a weapon. And Hyakkimaru is not at the point in his life where he can see things in that way. I think that's just like a really elegant way of presenting visually and through action where Hyakkimaru's at as a character and where his limitations are and how he needs to grow. And Biwamaru is like critical in how that whole scene plays out.
Absolutely. I think that's a good scene and another good one down the home stretch. And it's got Nakamura Yuichi in it, who I just immediately recognized and was like, yep, that's who they got. Because there's a lot of, we haven't talked about this, but there's a lot of big guest stars in the show along the way. You have him there. You have, don't you have, you have Otani Ikue as it's the Yokai Kozo character in episodes 14 to 15. And there's other ones, Koyama Mami as Bandai in episode 2. You know, some of these being figures from like the era of the original Dororo, like Koyama Mami. But then I think the funniest one, even though I don't really like how they use this character in this show, is that Tsukaroku in the original Dororo was voiced by Son Goku. So what do we do this time? We get Naruto herself, Takeuchi Junko.
Yes, I do love that. Again, like, Tsukaroku's not like a huge character here. It is just very funny. And it's just the Naruto voice. Like, she's just using the Naruto voice for the character, which makes sense. But yeah, that's very good. You do have a couple other ones. So you have like Inoue Marina is Osushi. The big one is, for me, is Mizuki Nana is Mio. And we didn't really talk about that. Let's talk about that Mio two-parter, because I think that's one of the, if you know, the Midodo is one of the best remixes of existing material. I would say the other one is the Mio two-parter.
Sure.
Because this is where I think the structure, I think they're very smart in how they change the structure of the show. Because in the original, this is a big flashback of telling us about Hyakkimaru's past and how he became the person he is. And I like that they lift that out of being a flashback and make it a current day adventure, because it's one of the things of that original where I think the early stories are so overwhelmed by having two big flashbacks right in a row, that it kind of is, it's one of those things that makes it feel like, to me, Dororo and Hyakkimaru have only been together for like a week or something by the time they get to the Banmon. And so I like the way that they adjust it here. But this is also where they take some of the, I think, Dororo's gender stuff, and even if they don't fully reveal it to the audience at this point, I think it is like a very central part of the story, because they have adjusted it to where Mio is working as a sex worker, a prostitute, in order to make money to survive, right? She's selling herself to people in the armies, the Sakura and Daigo armies that are camped opposite to each other. And there's this really powerful scene, and this is, I think, like Dororo's best scene in this show, is when she has spied on Mio. She's realized what Mio's doing, because of course she's hiding it from all the other orphans. And Dororo, I think it kind of comes out that Dororo realized and knows what it is, and they have this brief conversation. And, Mio like feels like she is very dirtied and sullied by this thing that she's resorting to in order to survive. And I love what Dororo tells her of like, my mom, like, I know what this is because this is the one thing my mom never did. Like, that's the context in which Dororo knows what prostitution is, and presumably basically knows what sex is. But she says, like, you doing what you need to survive is like, I don't know what word to use in English for this, but it's like respectable. She uses the word rippa, like rippa no kotoda. Like it's a proper thing. It's a like respectable thing. It's a thing to be praised that you have done this in order to survive. Because yes, it's a line that my mom never crossed, but my mom also died. And maybe if she had crossed that line, she could have lived. And she's not condemning her mom in that moment, but I like the maturity of this, of saying it's like, there is nothing wrong with you doing this in order to live. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you dirtied. And it's a really powerful moment. And I think it's one where it says a lot about, I think, why Dororo's gender is hidden, which the show never explicitly tells us, right? Itachi questions it in the 3-parter with the sharks. But there's no answer to it. But I think the clear answer is like that women are one of the people who are marginalized and abused and are sacrificed in this kind of society. And so it is safer for Dororo to present herself as a man than it is for her to present herself as a girl. And I think like the way that episode, I think, kind of explores that dynamic is really effective.
I 100% agree. And I do, I don't know. I wish there was maybe a little, this is where, again, Dororo just gets lost in the shuffle a little bit down the home stretch, because after the stuff with the Shiranui 3-parter, which is exactly how the gender is revealed in the manga too, is at that point. There isn't a lot of discussion of it. There isn't like a kind of meeting of the minds between Dororo and Hyakkimaru on it, other than this sense that Hyakkimaru, and it's not verbalized in the same way, but it's similar to what the 69 show does, which is that he's always known and just hasn't cared in that sense. It has not affected his view of Dororo. I don't know. It's such a potent moment early on that Dororo understands this as a little girl, as someone who had a mom who didn't do it, as someone who lost a mom. And that meeting of the minds there is really fascinating. And I wonder if we could have gotten a couple more moments that dealt with that, even though, again, overall, I think it handles it well.
Yeah. And that's just like that 2-parter is very powerful. All the characters getting killed, and then Hyakkimaru going to his like first rage. And that's the first time he really kills a person, right? Obviously, he technically kills the guy in the cursed sword one, but he's completely possessed. In this one, it's just regular people doing horrible things. And Hyakkimaru murders the ever-living shit out of those guys.
To be fair, they had it fucking coming. Those guys had it fucking coming.
Yeah, no, they deserved it for sure. I'm not criticizing Hyakkimaru, but he, it's not a calm, I'm going to do what I need to. It's like, no, I'm going to fucking rip these dudes to shreds. And it's very brutal.
Well, because it's the first time we really get a heavy vocalization out of him, because he's just gotten his voice back, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
But he hasn't been using it. He notably has not been using it. And then it's this guttural scream of fury. So, yeah. Are there any other like specific stories in the show that we haven't touched on that we should?
So let's touch on Jukai a little bit, because he has obviously a more expanded role here, voiced by the great Osuke Akio, who
Yep.
I love that, the most evil person and most important person in Hyakkimaru's life have both been voiced by Osuke Akio, two different things, whether it's Daigo or Jukai here. But you do get 2 Jukai-themed episodes, the story of Jukai, which is episode 3, and then you get the story of questions and answers, which is where they are reunited. And of course, he comes back into the finale as well, because that's where all the moms come together to save the little boy. And I love what they do with this character. I like these just like the idea is so evocative of this guy going around to battlefields and replacing the dead bodies, like limbs and like lost eyes and stuff with prosthetics. And that's his way of trying to sort of atone, is just like such a powerful image. But that episode of the story of questions and answers, I think just is one of the really standout episodes of the show, because it's where Jukai really sort of interrogates what Hyakkimaru is doing, because Jukai very powerfully knows the consequence of engaging in violence and what that does to who you are as a person, even if that violence is something that he's not really responsible for, right? Jukai obviously was, in the flashbacks, he was used as a tool by his lord to do this violence, but it has totally ruined Jukai's entire life.
Yeah,
right?
we
It's
see
like
him crucifying people. It's very brutal, yeah.
Yeah, and he's obviously doing it on someone else's orders, but he was still doing it. And so he is trying to, try to navigate this really complicated scenario with Hyakkimaru, but also kind of can't, because he doesn't know what it's like. This like nobody can know what it's like other than Hyakkimaru to have lost all these things and have them taken from you. But I love the conclusion of that story is so powerful. You kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but where after all of this, and Jukai refusing to give Hyakkimaru a new leg because he's worried what Hyakkimaru is going to do with it, Hyakkimaru kills all the demons that are growing off of a tree, which is a cool fight and a really cool image. And then when he's going to go, he asks Jukai his name, because this is the first time Hyakkimaru's ever been able to talk to Jukai. And then Jukai says, "No, I don't have a name worthy of telling you." And then Hyakkimaru, it's the best line that Hyakkimaru has in the whole show, is he just goes, "No, I know what people like you are called. You're called Okka-chan." And he uses the same, mom, but he uses the same sort of like accent that Dororo has in that moment. And that's where like Osuke Akio's reaction, as like the voice performance he gives of like the laugh cry of that he's laughing at how silly it is, but also he's so touched to the deepest part of his soul that someone sees him in that way, and how important he is to Hyakkimaru's life. And then I love the little extra touch where the little half-dead demon thing sort of bites his ankle and then fades away, because he had not been attacked by any of the monsters in the episode. And then he has this little moment of saying, but because they had never seen me as something alive before this moment. And it's like, and that's the answer. That's the answer of the questions and answers episode, is like, all that other shit is fine, right? Like it's like, you can question the morality, you can question all these things, but at the end of the day, it comes down to this relationship between these two people and what Jukai has done for him. And that's what life is about. And I just think that's one of those really, really great episodes of this show.
I agree. And I agree that the best like piece of like scripting dialogue writing in the show is the, "I don't have a name for you. I know what you people like you are called, Okka-chan." Yeah, that's just a great, masterful little piece of writing. So.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you have a dry eye in that moment, I question you, because it's like, it really hit me.
And you're right that it's the nonverbal vocalization after that. That's why you get Osuke Akio. That's why it's not just the gravity he brings with his voice. It's the experience to be able to play what is kind of an unplayable moment, right?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of people who can do that, and Osuke Akio is one of them. So, yeah. No, Sean, this is a show that I'm liking the more we talk about, and that is the sign of a good show, and it's the reason we do this podcast, and it's the fun of doing these sometimes with these difference of backgrounds where I'm coming at it from such a different angle than you are, especially this time, like even more so than I think any of the Gundams or anything like that. It's not just that this is something you've seen before, it's that we saw these things backwards from each other.
Yes.
And so we're having a meeting of the minds here, and that's part of what's fun. And overall, I just have to say, the reason we did any Dororo is because you wanted to watch this show specifically, but it led us to doing both Dororos and, for me, the manga and everything. And I'm so happy. I'm so glad that we did the full Dororo, because this is one of the coolest little corners of anime. Honestly, a pretty big corner of anime for something that was 4 manga volumes. And I'm I'm teaching it in my class in a couple of weeks from when we're recording this. I have a class on animation for my 4,000 level students, and I have edited together episodes of Dororo 69 into what I'm just cheekily calling Dororo the movie. I edited them together. What I'm doing is episodes 1, 2, the beginning of 3, which resolves the last scene of episode 2, because 2 ends with it's actually episode 1 ends with Hyakkimaru's eye falling out. Episode 2 does the flashback, and then episode 3 picks up the scene with the eyeball. So it ends that whole thing. And then I'm jumping ahead to the Bonbon 3-parter, and then jumping ahead to episode 26, and just doing a little taste of the whole show. I've also used the end credits, which in the DVD versions are just creditless. They're just that. I've put in credits so that people can see who directed it and wrote it and all that. But I've also put in little summaries of between these 2 episodes, the characters go off and do this. So it's about a 2.5-hour presentation, and I'm very excited for that. But I'm glad also now that I've seen the 2019 show and given me another way to think about this entire show and experience to talk about with my students. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah. This has been one of my favorite podcasts we've done. Both of the Dororos. I'm so glad that we did the first one as well.
Yes.
I think this was a cool way to experience this, especially because I do think that this show, specifically the 2019 show, has such an interesting kind of complicated comparison to the first. I think that has kind of come out in how we broke it down and discussed it from these different perspectives. But yeah, I love Dororo as the whole thing. I'm very excited to finish the game, the Blood Will Tell game, because I played a lot of it over my winter break. And I kind of fell off of it because we ended up pushing this podcast 3 weeks or something from when we were going to originally record it. So I kind of waited a little bit, and I ended up...
There was a period there, Sean, where I did not have a TV or Blu-ray player set up, so I just, I didn't have a way to watch it.
No, it's a totally fair reason why we pushed it back, but it just is, This was a long journey to get this podcast for something that was only a 24-episode show. But yes, I'm very excited for that. I'll probably never watch the live action movie, but that's out there somewhere. There's a whole cool manga. There's a weird fucking manga. Dota, it's a whole thing. It's a whole world that you just wouldn't expect to be out there. But it's a cool fucking series. But Jonathan, we are not stopping. Well, we're stopping with Dota, but we're not stopping with Tezuka Osamu, because next week we have one of the most exciting things for me personally, the thing I'm most excited about to cover.
Yes.
Because I really don't know what to expect from the...
I don't either.
Next time.
Yeah. We are covering what is famously known as the Animerama trilogy, which was a set of 3 mixes of experimental and narrative films that Tezuka's company made. Tezuka heavily involved in the first 2, not as much in the third one, but all from Mushi Pro, or what it was named after the bankruptcy or whatever. Yeah. These are Cleopatra, 1001 Nights, Belladonna of Sadness. They are all pretty infamous. They were not just that they were trying to be more experimental and theatrical, but they were also adult, and they are also partially erotic, and they are also in a moment in Japanese live action cinema that is the Japanese new wave, and I think they are very heavily rated to that. We've touched on that with the Lupin season with Seijun Suzuki, who's a key figure there, but these are definitely adjacent to all of that, and I have not seen them yet. I don't think you've seen them yet.
No. I know of the reputation of Cleopatra and 1001 Nights. I'd never actually heard of Belladonna of Sadness before we were planning to do this podcast.
That's actually the famous one in film school circles, because it's gotten some play in academia, because it's the most out there of the 3, is my understanding.
Yeah, but I'm very excited to watch these and cover them. We've never covered erotic movies before, but I really love this era of Japanese movies. I've seen most of Seijun Suzuki stuff. I've seen a lot of other they're just... It's a very fascinating sort of genre and world that pushes a lot of boundaries, and I'm curious to see how that happens with anime. So we will be watching the Animerama trilogy next time on Japanimation Station.